Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The Hollow's Throat. The scrub brush made a sound like sandpaper against leather, a dry rasping that filled the dimly lit basement and seemed to hang in the air like dust motes dancing in the single bare bulb's yellowed glow. Dr. Harold Vance worked with the methodical precision of a man who had long ago passed through the membrane of madness and emerged on the other side into a landscape of crystalline, terrible clarity. His hands, which had once delivered calves and set the broken wings of owls, now moved in slow, deliberate circles across the surface of the egg, working the mixture of bleach and salt into the leathery pores with a tenderness that bordered on the obscene. The egg was massive, standing nearly 4 feet tall and requiring a modified galvanized washtub to cradle its weight, its surface the color of old bruises, mottled purples and sickly yellows that shifted in the weak light like oil on water. It was not smooth, not like the eggs of birds or reptiles that Harold had studied in veterinary school decades ago. Instead, it was pebbled and coarse, covered in a thin membrane of mucus that resisted the bleach at first, then yielded with a soft sighing sound as the chemicals penetrated the outer layer. Harold hummed as he worked, his voice a cracked and tuneless thing that nevertheless managed to convey something achingly like love, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him in the hollows of these same Ozark Mountains 60 years prior, though the words had long since dissolved into meaningless vowels, leaving only the melody, a rising and falling cadence that matched the rhythm of his scrubbing. The basement smelled of ammonia and copper, of the special kind of fear that seeped from the walls of old houses where terrible bargains had been struck and maintained through generations of silence. Harold did not look at the door behind him, though he knew it was there, knew that beyond it lay the stairs leading up to his modest kitchen, and beyond that, the narrow road that wound through Boone County toward the limestone cliffs where Devil's Hole waited like a rotten tooth in the jaw of the earth. He did not think about his daughter, though she was the reason for all of this, the reason he had spent 3 weeks sleeping in 20-minute intervals, waking to check the egg's temperature with a thermometer he sterilized between each use, the reason he had sold his practice and liquidated his savings to buy industrial quantities of salt and bleach and iron filings from suppliers who had stopped asking questions after the 3rd transaction. The creature inside the shell moved sometimes, a slow, ponderous shift of weight that made the washtub groan and the floorboards vibrate, and when it moved, Harold scrubbed harder, hummed louder, because silence was the thing the mother hated most. Silence was the trigger for the debt to be called in full, and the mother had a very particular understanding of what constituted payment. He had seen her only once, 18 years ago, when he had been a young man hiking the cliffs with his own father, before the cancer took the old man in a merciful 6 months. They had found the fissure reopened by a minor earthquake, a crack in the earth no wider than a man's shoulders, but exhaling a breath so cold and ancient that Harold's father's mustache had frosted white in the September afternoon. Harold had peered into that darkness, and something in the darkness had peered back, eyes like reflectors on a highway, catching light that shouldn't have existed in that subterranean void, and beneath the eyes, a shape that his brain had refused to assemble into coherence, a suggestion of bristling fur and segmented plates, of limbs that bent wrong and a tail that curved like a scythe blade. His father had dragged him back, but not before Harold had heard the sound, the seesaw roar that had not been loud so much as it had been present, a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in the hollow spaces behind his eyes, in the fluid of his spine, in the marrow of his femurs. They had run, and his father had never spoken of it again, had died with the secret locked behind his teeth, but Harold had remembered, had carried the sound in his dreams for decades, until the night 3 weeks ago when the creature had come to his window, not the mother but one of her servants, a thing like a skinned dog with too many joints, and had left the egg on his porch with a note scratched into a piece of birch bark in a hand that might have been human once. 141. Keep it warm. The det RENEWS. Harold had understood then what his father had understood, what the entire town of Coldwater, Boone County, had understood since 1897, that the Gowrow was not a legend, not a campfire story to frighten children, but a landlord, a creditor, a thing that kept the ledger of lives with mathematical precision and accepted only specific currencies. The egg was due to hatch soon, perhaps within days, and Harold had begun to hope, in the desperate, delusional way that hostages hope for rescue, that if he could keep the hatchling alive, if he could prove his value as a caretaker, the mother might accept the young one in exchange for his daughter, who was currently sleeping upstairs in her childhood bedroom, unaware that her father had already begun to plan which of her limbs he would sacrifice first if the creature rejected his offering. The scrub brush caught on a raised ridge of tissue, and Harold paused, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The ridge was pulsing, a slow, rhythmic throb that matched the lullaby's tempo, and beneath the pebbled surface, pressed against the inner membrane like a child pressing its face against a fogged window, he could see the shape of a claw, no larger than a kitten's paw but tipped with translucent hooks that scratched at the leathery prison. "SHH," Harold whispered, his voice breaking. "SHH, SHH, little one. Not yet, not yet. Daddy's here." He did not know if he was speaking to the creature inside the egg or to his daughter upstairs, and in that moment of terrible ambiguity, he felt something inside himself fracture cleanly, like a bone snapping under torsion, and he wept as he scrubbed, wept until the bleach stung his eyes and the salt crusted in the lines of his face, while the egg pulsed and waited, and the mother in the deep earth listened to the sound of her debt being paid in tears and broken lullabies. The interstate had not been kind to Morgan Hale's suspension, and as his rust-eaten Subaru crested the final ridge overlooking Coldwater, Missouri, something in the undercarriage made a sound like a dying man's final exhalation, a metallic sigh that promised future mechanical catastrophe, but held off for the moment, as if even the car understood the gravity of their destination and wished to deliver him intact to whatever waited below. Morgan was 43 years old, though he looked older in the rearview mirror, the skin of his face having settled into the grooves and furrows of a man who had spent 2 decades chasing stories into dark places and emerging with only the scars to show for it. His hair, once a fierce red that had earned him the nickname Matchstick in his urban exploring days, had faded to the color of rusted wire, and his eyes, a pale gray that women had once found compelling, had developed a perpetual squint, as if he were always peering into a distance that never quite resolved into clarity. He was, by his own definition and that of several former employers, a disgraced historian, a man who had held a tenure-track position at a respectable state university until his obsession with the anomalous, the folkloric, and the officially denied had led him to publish a monograph suggesting that the 1927 Mississippi flood had been, in part, a deliberate act of ecological warfare rather than a natural disaster. The university had not fired him outright. They had simply made his position untenable, trimming his funding, assigning him to sections of American History 101 that met at 7 in the morning in buildings without heat, until he had resigned in a flurry of accusatory emails that he now recognized, in his more honest moments, as the death throes of a career rather than a principled stand. Since then, he had wandered the margins of academia and journalism, writing freelance pieces for conspiracy websites and true crime podcasts, living in his car for months at a time as he chased leads that inevitably dissolved into the miasma of unreliable testimony and deliberate obfuscation that characterized the study of what he had come to call the American hidden. The Boone County assignment had come through a producer named Deshaun Williams, a man Morgan had never met in person, but who communicated with the clipped urgency of someone perpetually managing multiple crises. Deshaun ran a podcast called American Echoes, a show that trafficked in historical mysteries and local legends with a production value that suggested serious advertising revenue, and he had contacted Morgan 6 weeks ago with a proposition that had seemed, at the time, like a lifeline. The 1897 Gowrow posse, Deshawn had said during their first phone call, his voice compressed by cellular transmission into a series of digital artifacts that made him sound like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. You've heard of it. Morgan had heard of it. Every folklorist and Ozark historian had heard of it. The story of a group of 20 men who had supposedly hunted and killed a creature in the caves near Devil's Hole, a beast variously described as a dragon, a dinosaur, or something older and stranger. The accounts were contradictory, the physical evidence non-existent, and the story had been dismissed by mainstream historians as a composite of several local panics, a piece of creative journalism by a young reporter named J.C. Now, who had admitted on his deathbed that he had fabricated most of the details. "I want you to debunk it," Deshawn had continued. "Not the way academics debunk things, dry, footnoted, boring. I want you to go there, walk the ground, talk to the people, and prove it's bullshit in a way that makes listeners feel like they're there with you. I want atmosphere. I want dread. I want the audience to think, just for a second, that maybe it's real before you pull the rug out." That's the hook. Morgan had accepted, not because he believed the story had merit. He had spent too many years in the wilderness of the unexplained to believe in easy monsters, but because the payday would cover 6 months of his dwindling savings, and because some part of him, the part that had driven him to flood theories and government cover-ups, and the long, fruitless search for the truth behind the 1949 Van Meter sightings, still hoped that this time, the mundane explanation would be satisfying enough to fill the hollow space that had opened in his chest when he had walked away from his office for the last time. Now, as the Subaru descended the winding county road into Coldwater, Morgan felt that familiar mixture of anticipation and resignation settling over him like a heavy coat. The town had not changed significantly since the photographs he had found in the state archives. A main street of brick buildings dating to the 1920s, a water tower painted with a faded mural of a fish that might have been a bass or might have been something more serpentine, a general store with a sign advertising live bait and lottery tickets. But there was something else, something the archival photographs had not captured, a quality to the air itself that made Morgan's sinuses ache and his skin prickle with a warning he could not quite articulate. The farms he passed as he drove through the outskirts were wrong somehow, though it took him several miles to identify the source of his unease. The fences were not the barbed wire or split-rail constructions typical of rural Missouri. Instead, they were made of rusted iron spikes, each one sharpened to a needle point and driven into the earth at intervals of exactly 3 feet, forming a barrier that rose nearly 6 feet high and enclosed pastures where cattle stood in tight, nervous clusters. The spikes were old, pitted with oxidation that suggested decades of exposure, but they were also maintained. The tips gleamed where they had been recently sharpened, and the bases were surrounded by circles of white powder that Morgan recognized, after a moment of confusion, as salt, mixed with something darker and more granular that might have been ash. The livestock moved within these enclosures with a peculiar, synchronized restlessness, as if they were performing a dance they had memorized but did not understand. And when Morgan slowed the Subaru to observe a cluster of Angus steers, every head turned simultaneously to watch him pass, their eyes reflecting the afternoon light with a flat, liquid intensity that made him accelerate despite himself. He had seen animals behave strangely before. He had once explored an abandoned slaughterhouse in Nebraska where the local dogs would not approach within 100 yards. But there was something rehearsed about this behavior, something that spoke of generations of conditioning rather than instinct. These animals had been taught to fear, and they had been taught precisely what to fear. Morgan drove on, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, telling himself that he was imagining things, that the altitude was affecting his judgment, that the bleached quality of the Ozark light was playing tricks on his perception. But he could not shake the feeling that he had crossed an invisible boundary, that the town of Coldwater was not merely a destination but a threshold, and that somewhere beyond the tree line, something was watching him arrive with the patience of a creditor who had already calculated the exact moment when payment would come due. He checked into the Coldwater Inn, a two-story clapboard structure that smelled of cedar chips and old cooking grease, run by a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Peabody, who moved with the careful deliberation of someone nursing a chronic pain she refused to acknowledge. She took his credit card with fingers gnarled by arthritis and slid a key across the counter, a physical key, not a key card, attached to a plastic diamond stamped with the number 7. "You hear about the caves," she said. It was not a question. "I'm doing some research," Morgan replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Historical research. The 1897 incident." Mrs. Peabody's face underwent a transformation so subtle it might have been imaginary, a tightening around the eyes and a flattening of the lips that suggested she had tasted something sour. "We don't talk about that much," she said. "Not with outsiders." "I'm not looking to cause trouble," Morgan said, though he suspected this was a lie or at least an oversimplification. Trouble was what he did. Trouble was what had driven him from respectability into the arms of podcast producers and conspiracy theorists. "I'm just looking for the truth." The old woman's laugh was a dry, rattling thing like beans in a gourd. "Truth," she repeated. "That's a funny word to use around here. You want truth, you go see Doc Vance. He knows all about truth. He knows what it costs." She turned away before he could ask for clarification, disappearing through a door behind the counter that led, presumably, into her own living quarters, leaving Morgan alone with the key and the faint, persistent smell of salt that seemed to permeate the very walls of the lobby. His room was on the second floor, overlooking the main street, and as he unpacked his bag, a single duffel containing 3 changes of clothes, his recording equipment, and a leather-bound journal filled with notes on the 1897 posse, he found himself returning to the window again and again, studying the street below with a vigilance he could not justify. The town was quiet in the way that only rural communities could be quiet, not peaceful but expectant, as if holding its breath. A pickup truck rolled past, its bed filled with fencing supplies that gleamed with the same rusted iron he had seen surrounding the farms. An old man sat on a bench outside the hardware store, not reading, not talking, simply sitting with his hands folded over the head of a walking stick carved from dark wood. Morgan watched him for 10 minutes, and in that time the man did not move, did not blink, did not acknowledge the passage of the truck or the fluttering of a sparrow that landed briefly on his knee before flying away. It was not until the light began to fade, bleeding from the sky in shades of purple and bruised orange, that the old man finally stirred, lifting his head to sniff the air like a dog catching a scent, then rising with a fluidity that belied his apparent age and walking away with a stride that carried him rapidly toward the eastern edge of town, toward the limestone cliffs that Morgan knew from his maps concealed the entrance to Devil's Hole. Morgan slept poorly that first night, his dreams filled with the sound of scraping, something heavy dragging itself across wet stone, and a voice humming a tune he almost recognized. He woke 3 times, each time convinced that something was standing in the corner of the room watching him, though the corner was empty when he turned on the light, save for a faint residue of salt on the floorboards that he told himself was simply the detritus of an old building, the accumulated grime of decades of tenants. By morning, he had convinced himself that his nerves were simply reacting to the pressure of the assignment, the need to produce something compelling for Deshawn's audience, and he set out to find Dr. Vance with the determined optimism of a man who believes that daylight dispels all monsters. He found the veterinarian's office on the edge of town, a converted farmhouse with a painted sign depicting a smiling dog and cat, though the paint had faded to the point where the animals looked more like skulls than pets. The front door was locked, a handwritten sign taped to the glass reading, "Closed until further notice," but Morgan could see a light burning in the basement window, a sickly yellow illumination that flickered as if powered by an unsteady generator. He knocked, first politely, then with increasing insistence, until the door finally opened a crack and a face peered out at him. A face that made Morgan step back involuntarily, his hand rising to his chest as if to ward off a blow. Harold Vance had the look of a man who had not slept in weeks, but it was more than simple fatigue. His eyes were sunken so deeply into their sockets that they seemed to float in darkness, the skin around them bruised to a color that matched the mottled surface of the egg he had been scrubbing in his basement. His cheeks were hollow, his lips cracked and flecked with dried blood, and his hair, what remained of it, stood out from his scalp in greasy spikes, as if he had been tearing at it in his sleep. But it was his expression that chilled Morgan most, a look of desperate, feral hope, the expression of a drowning man who has spotted what might be a hand reaching toward him from the surface, or might be another trick of the light in the deep water. "You're the historian," Vance said, his voice a rasp that barely rose above a whisper. "The one asking questions. Mrs. Peabody called me." "I just want to talk," Morgan said, though he found himself wanting very much not to talk to this man, to turn around and drive back to the interstate and keep driving until the Ozarks were a memory and the podcast was someone else's problem. About the 1897 posse. About the Gowrow. Vance's eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they nearly swallowed the pale blue irises, and he glanced over his shoulder into the darkness of the house behind him. "You shouldn't say that name," he hissed. "Not out loud, not where she can hear." "Where who can hear?" Morgan asked, though he suspected he already knew, suspected that the thing in the caves had a name that functioned not as identification but as invocation, a syllable that opened doors best left closed. "The mother," Vance whispered, and as he spoke the words, something in the house behind him moved, a heavy shifting weight that made the floorboards groan, and Morgan smelled something that he would later try to describe in his journal as the scent of a thunderstorm trapped in a wound, copper and ozone, and a deeper, organic rot that spoke of meat left too long in summer heat. "You want to know about the covenant," Vance continued, his hand emerging from behind the door to grip Morgan's wrist with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in parchment. "You want to know why the town is still here, why we're still here. You want the truth, like you told Mrs. Peabody. Well, the truth is in the basement, Mr. Hale. The truth is growing. And if you want to hear it, you need to come inside. But I warn you, once you see it, once you know it, you don't get to unknow it. That's the nature of debt. It compounds." Morgan should have walked away. Every instinct honed by 2 decades of investigating the dark corners of American history screamed at him to break the grip on his wrist, to run to his car, to leave Boone County and never return. But he had not driven 600 miles to turn back at the threshold of the story, and some part of him, a part he would later recognize as the same hubris that had destroyed his academic career, whispered that this was the moment, the encounter that would make the podcast something more than another debunking, that would transform it into the kind of story people remembered and whispered about in the dark. He let Vance pull him inside, and the door closed behind them with a finality that sounded very much like a lock engaging on a cell door. The basement was worse than Morgan had imagined, though he would struggle, in later attempts to describe it, to identify exactly what made it so terrible. It was not the egg itself, though the egg was monstrous, a leathery, veined thing that pulsed with a slow, arrhythmic heartbeat visible through the translucent patches of its surface. It was not the smell, though the smell was overwhelming, a compound of ammonia and decay, and something sweetly fungal that coated the back of his throat and made his eyes water. It was not even the knowledge of what grew inside, though Morgan would never forget the moment when a shape pressed against the inner membrane, a suggestion of limbs and a head too large for its body, a silhouette that his visual cortex processed as wrong before his conscious mind could intervene. No, the worst thing was the care with which Harold Vance tended this monstrosity, the love that radiated from his hunched form as he resumed his scrubbing, humming that broken lullaby while the thing in the tub responded to his voice with movements that might have been affection or might have been hunger. 3 weeks, Vance said, not looking up from his work. 3 weeks since she delivered it. I have to keep the shell clean or the fungus gets in. I have to keep it warm or it dies. And I have to keep it alive, Mr. Hale, because the debt doesn't work the way you think. The 1897 posse didn't kill the Gowrow. Nothing can kill her. She's too old, too deep, too much a part of the stone itself. What the posse did, what the survivors did, was make a deal. Morgan found his voice, though it emerged as a croak that barely resembled speech. What kind of deal? A covenant, Vance said, and the word sounded archaic on his tongue, a term from theology rather than history. A substitution. The mother doesn't hunt indiscriminately, Mr. Hale. She's not a beast, not in the way you mean. She's a system, an ecology. The caves are her body and the things that live in them are her cells. But even systems need fuel, and her appetite is substantial. In 1897, when the mining opened the deep fissure and she began to range onto the surface, the town didn't fight her. They couldn't. 19 men died in the first week, torn apart in their fields, dragged screaming into sinkholes that opened beneath their feet like mouths. The 20th man, Jonas Coldwater, the town's founder, he understood. He went into the caves alone, unarmed, and he spoke to her, or she spoke to him. The details don't matter. What matters is the agreement. The town would provide. Livestock mostly. A few head of cattle each season, some pigs, sheep. Enough to keep her satisfied, to keep her below. And if the livestock wasn't enough? Vance paused, his scrubbing slowing, his shoulders hunching further as if to protect himself from a blow. Sometimes people disappear, Mr. Hale, not many. One every few years, someone who won't be missed, someone from outside. The town calls them accidents or runaways or suicides, but we know, we all know, because we all pay one way or another. My father paid with his silence. I paid with my service. And now, he gestured toward the egg with a hand that trembled. Now she wants more. The mining company, Mr. Hale, they've been blasting in the ridges east of Devil's Hole. Fracking, they call it, though what they're really doing is cracking the earth's bones. They've breached the upper cavern. They've disturbed the nursery. And now she's angry, Mr. Hale. Now she's awake, and she's hungry, and the old debts aren't enough. Morgan felt the floor tilt beneath him, not physically but perceptually, as if the room had become a funhouse mirror distorting everything he thought he knew about the town, the legend, his own purpose in coming here. The eggs, he said, his mind racing ahead to conclusions he did not want to reach. She's laying eggs. Clutching, Vance corrected. She's been clutching for decades, maybe centuries, but the deep heat kept them dormant. The fracking changed the temperature gradient. It woke them. There are dozens in the deep caverns, maybe hundreds, and they're all reaching maturity at once. The mother isn't just hunting for herself anymore, Mr. Hale. She's hunting for her children. And when they hatch, when they all hatch at once, there won't be enough livestock in the world to satisfy them. The egg pulsed, a strong contraction that sent ripples across its surface, and Morgan heard, for the first time, a sound from within, not the cry of a bird or the mewling of a mammal, but a wet, clicking chatter, like teeth tapping against wet bone, or claws testing the edge of a blade. Vance began to scrub faster, his humming rising in pitch towards something that resembled panic. "You need to leave," he said, though his voice suggested he did not believe Morgan could leave, that the door had been a one-way passage. "You need to get in your car and drive and never look back. But you won't, will you? You're like all the others. You think you're going to tell this story, expose the truth, make the world believe. But the world doesn't want to believe, Mr. Hale. The world wants to eat and sleep and forget. And the things that don't forget, the things that remember the old debts, they're the ones who end up in the ledger." Morgan wanted to argue, wanted to assert his rationality, his skepticism, his hard-won conviction that monsters were metaphors and covenants were conspiracy theories. But he could not tear his eyes from the egg, from the shape moving behind its leathery wall, and he could not ignore the vibration in his chest, a resonance that matched the egg's pulse, as if something inside him was tuning itself to the same frequency, preparing to hatch. "I need to see the caves," he said, and the words emerged without his conscious volition, a statement of intent that felt more like prophecy than decision. "I need to see Devil's Hole." Vance stopped scrubbing. He turned his head slowly, and in his eyes Morgan saw not madness but a terrible, lucid grief, the look of a man who has watched another step onto a train track and lacks the strength to pull him back. "Then you'd better hurry," Vance said, "because she's already listening, and she's already hungry." Morgan spent the rest of that day in a fog of half-realized terror and compulsive note-taking, driving the winding roads around Coldwater with his recorder running, capturing the ambient sounds of the town, the clang of iron fencing being repaired, the lowing of cattle in their salt circles, the peculiar absence of birdsong in the dense oak and hickory forests that should have been alive with spring migration. He told himself he was gathering atmosphere for the podcast, building the audio landscape that Deshawn had requested. But beneath the professional justification ran a current of desperate documentation, the urge to preserve evidence of a world that felt increasingly fragile, as if the membrane between the ordinary and the monstrous had thinned to the point of translucence and might tear entirely if he pressed too hard. He found the old mining road by accident, following a gravel track that branched off from the county highway and wound through hillsides scarred by decades of limestone extraction. The recent fracking operations were obvious. New access roads cut through virgin forest, heavy equipment parked in clearings, the telltale infrastructure of an industry that had promised prosperity and delivered desolation. But it was the geology that drew Morgan's attention, the way the limestone outcroppings seemed to fold in on themselves, creating natural amphitheaters where the sound of his engine died abruptly, swallowed by stone that had been shaped by water and time into configurations that resembled, more than anything else, the architecture of a throat. He parked at the end of the road, where a chain-link fence marked the boundary of the active mining lease, and climbed out into an afternoon that had grown unnaturally still. The air here tasted of dust and something else, something mineral and ancient that made his tongue feel coated in metal filings. He walked to the fence, his boots crunching on gravel that seemed too white, too clean, as if it had been washed repeatedly by something that left no trace but sterility. Beyond the fence, the ground dropped away into a sinkhole, a natural depression in the limestone that had been widened by recent blasting into a crater roughly 50 feet across. Morgan could see the exposed strata, layers of rock that recorded millions of years of sedimentary history, but it was the lowest layer that made him grip the fence until his knuckles whitened. A band of dark stone that did not match the surrounding limestone, a band that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and within which something had been fossilized, something with too many joints and a tail that curved like a question mark. He was not a paleontologist, but he knew enough to recognize that the shape in the stone was not any creature that had been cataloged by science, not any beast that had walked the earth in the era of sedimentary deposition. It was wrong in a way that preceded taxonomy, wrong in a way that suggested the fossil record had gaps not because of incomplete preservation, but because some things had buried themselves too deep to be found, had chosen obscurity as a survival strategy. Morgan raised his recorder, his voice shaking as he narrated, "I'm standing at the edge of what the locals call the New Breach, approximately 2 miles east of Devil's Hole proper. The mining company," he paused, his eyes tracking a movement in the sinkhole, a shadow that seemed to detach from the dark band of stone and slide upward along the crater wall. "The mining company has exposed something. I don't know what I'm looking at." "I don't." The shadow moved again, and Morgan realized with a chill that ran from his coccyx to his crown that it was not a shadow at all but a fissure, a crack in the earth that had not been visible moments before, a crack that was widening with a sound like tearing fabric, and from within it exhaled a breath so cold that his recorder's digital display fogged over, and the metal of the fence burned his palm with freezing temperature. He stumbled backward, his narration dissolving into wordless gasping, and as he fell to the gravel, he heard it for the first time. The seesaw roar, not loud but inescapable, a frequency that seemed to originate inside his skull rather than outside it, a sound that made his vision blur and his stomach convulse with nausea. It was not a single tone but a chord, a complex waveform that rose and fell in a rhythm that might have been breathing or might have been speech. And beneath the audible frequencies, Morgan felt something else, a subsonic vibration that traveled through the bones of his feet and up his legs, bypassing his ears entirely to resonate in the hollow spaces of his pelvis, his ribs, his sinuses. The effect was immediate and devastating. His sense of direction dissolved, his proprioception failing so completely that when he tried to stand, he found himself moving toward the sinkhole rather than away from it, his body betraying him with a robotic compliance that suggested his nervous system had been hijacked by a signal he could neither hear nor resist. He collapsed again, vomiting onto the white gravel, and the physical crisis seemed to break the sound's hold, allowing him to crawl backward toward the Subaru with movements that were more animal than human, gasping and whining in a way that would have humiliated him if he had been capable of shame. He reached the car, hauled himself into the driver's seat, and started the engine with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. As he reversed down the gravel track, his headlights swept across the sinkhole one final time, and in the afterimage burned onto his retinas, he thought he saw something emerging from the fissure, something pale and segmented and wrong. Before the curve of the road blocked his view, and he was left with only the sound of his own screaming and the seesaw roar that continued, he realized with growing horror, even after he had driven a mile away, even after he had rolled up the windows and pressed his hands to his ears, even after he had convinced himself that he was safe. The sound was not coming from outside anymore. It was inside him now, a frequency he carried like a tuning fork struck once and vibrating forever, and he knew with a certainty that transcended reason that the mother had heard him, had tasted him with her terrible sonar, and had marked him for the ledger. He did not return to the Coldwater Inn. He drove until he found a chain motel 30 miles away, in a town large enough to have a Walmart and a McDonald's and the comforting anonymity of traffic lights and strip malls. He checked in under a false name, paying cash, and spent the night in the bathtub with the shower running, as if the water could wash the sound from his bones. But the seesaw roar persisted, a background hum that made his teeth ache and his vision pulse with each rise and fall of its terrible cadence. He slept in fits, dreaming of dark water and leathery eggs, of Harold Vance scrubbing and scrubbing, while something vast moved in the depths below him. By morning, he had reached a state of exhausted detachment, a clinical numbness that allowed him to function despite the terror. He reviewed his recording from the sinkhole, listening through noise-canceling headphones to the moments before the roar, trying to identify what he had seen in the fissure. The audio was distorted, the digital file corrupted by what his software described as anomalous frequency interference. But beneath the static, he could hear his own voice, trembling but coherent, describing the exposed strata, the dark band of stone, the wrongness of the fossil. And then, at the moment when the fissure had opened, there was a sound that his microphone had captured with horrifying clarity, not the roar itself, which had overloaded the input and reduced 30 seconds of audio to digital screaming, but a wet, rhythmic clicking, like claws tapping against stone in a pattern that might have been Morse code or might have been a heartbeat. And beneath the clicking, so faint he had to amplify it 3 times to hear it, a voice. Not his own, not human, a voice that said or seemed to say more, more, more. Morgan deleted the file, his finger hovering over the delete key for a full minute before he pressed it, and then he sat in the motel room with the curtains drawn against the afternoon light, trying to decide whether to drive back to St. Louis, to call Deshawn and tell him the story was dead, to return to the half-life of conspiracy podcasts and academic irrelevance. But he could not do it. The sound in his head would not let him rest, and worse than the sound was the knowing, the knowledge that he had touched something real, something that existed outside the boundaries of debunking and explanation, and that having touched it, he was now responsible for it in ways he did not yet understand. He thought of Harold Vance, of the love in the man's eyes as he tended the egg, and he understood, for the first time, that the vet was not insane. He was simply a man who had accepted the terms of a debt that could never be fully repaid, who had found in servitude a kind of purpose that freedom could not offer. Morgan did not want to become such a man, but he suspected, with the same certainty that told him the mother was listening, that he was already on the path, that the ledger had opened to a fresh page with his name at the top, and that the only way to close the account was to see the story through to its end, wherever that end might lead. He returned to Coldwater the following afternoon, the seesaw roar in his head having settled into a manageable thrum, a background noise he could almost ignore if he concentrated on other things. He went first to the county courthouse, a brick building with a clock tower that had stopped at 11:47. He noted the time with a superstitious chill, though he could not have said why, and requested access to the property records for the farms with the iron spike fences. The clerk, a young woman with a tattoo of a tree on her wrist that seemed, to Morgan's strained perception, to move slightly when he wasn't looking directly at it, produced a map that showed the fenced properties in a pattern that made his breath catch. They were not random. They formed a rough circle, a perimeter nearly 10 miles in diameter, centered on Devil's Hole. Each property within the circle was owned by families with names that appeared in the 1897 census, names that had persisted through generations with a tenacity that suggested endogamy or conspiracy or both. And each property had a notation in the margin, a symbol that the clerk identified as the county's mark for historical covenant lands, though she could not explain what the covenant entailed or when it had been established. "It's just always been there," she said, shrugging. "My grandpa had the same notation on his farm out on Ridge Road. We kept the fence up even after he died. Mom says it's for the insurance, but I know it's because of the old stories." "What old stories?" Morgan asked, though he suspected he already knew. The clerk leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to compete with the seesaw roar for dominance in Morgan's auditory cortex. "She visits," the clerk said. "Not often. Every few years when the debt's due. She comes up from the deep places and she walks the perimeter. If the fence is down, if the salt's not fresh. Well, the Carver family found out in '84, tore down their fence to put in a swimming pool. 3 days later, their youngest was gone. Just gone. They found his shoes by the well, but that was all. After that, nobody questions the covenant. Nobody even talks about it." Morgan left the courthouse with copies of the maps and a growing certainty that the debunking Deshawn had requested was impossible, that the story of the 1897 posse was not a legend to be dismantled, but a living contract to be honored, a system of exchange that had sustained itself for over a century through the complicity of silence and the mathematics of sacrifice. He drove the perimeter next, following the circle of iron and salt, recording his observations for a podcast that he now knew would never air, at least not in the form Deshawn imagined. The farms were pristine, almost unnaturally so, the fields tilled with geometric precision, the barns painted and maintained with a care that spoke of fear rather than pride. At each property, he saw the same thing: livestock in salt circles, their movements synchronized and strange. Farmers who watched him from porches or barn doors with expressions that held no welcome, only a weary resignation. Children who played not in the yards but in the centers of the circles, as if the salt lines were protective charms rather than penning. And at each property, as he slowed the Subaru to observe, he felt the seesaw roar in his head pulse in recognition, as if the mother were following his progress around her territory, tasting his presence at each point of the compass, approving or disapproving of his obedience to the unspoken rules of her domain. By the time he completed the circuit, dusk was bleeding into the hollows, and Morgan found himself at the northern edge of the circle, where the limestone cliffs rose in a palisade that marked the boundary between the farmland and the wilderness, between the world of covenants and the world of teeth. He parked and climbed out, his legs stiff from hours of driving, and stood at the base of the cliffs, looking up at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to pierce the purple veil. The rocks here were different from the limestone he had seen at the fracking site. Older, denser, shot through with veins of quartz that caught the fading light and seemed to glow with an internal phosphorescence. And in the cliff face, barely visible in the gathering dark, he could see the mouths of caves, dozens of them, ranging from openings no wider than a man's shoulders to yawning passages that breathed cold air into the evening. Devil's Hole was somewhere above him, the main entrance to the network of caverns that honeycombed these hills, but Morgan could not see it from his vantage, could only sense its presence as a gravitational pull, a weight in the earth that bent his attention toward it like a compass needle finding north. He raised his recorder, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands, and spoke into the dark. "I'm at the base of the limestone cliffs north of Coldwater, approximately half a mile from the documented entrance to Devil's Hole. The town's covenant, the true covenant, not the legend of the posse, is a geographical reality. The farms are arranged in a defensive perimeter. The iron and salt are not superstition, they are architecture, a kind of immune system designed to repel an invader that has never been fully defeated, only managed. I am beginning to understand that the Gowrow," he paused, the name feeling dangerous on his tongue, a word that opened doors. "The entity in these caves is not a single monster but a colony, a breeding population that has been held in check for generations through a system of tribute and territorial engineering. And I am beginning to understand that the fracking has compromised this system, that the new breach has provided an egress point that bypasses the old defenses, and that the entity, the mother, is preparing to expand her range. The eggs in Doc Vance's basement are not an anomaly. They are the beginning of a new phase. And I am standing at the threshold of her kingdom, trying to decide whether to knock or run." The recorder's light blinked red in the darkness, a small beacon of technological presence in a landscape that predated electricity by millennia, and as Morgan lowered the device, he heard a sound from above. A scraping like stone against stone, and he looked up to see a shape silhouetted against the darkening sky, a shape that blocked the stars with a mass that suggested something between a bear and a crocodile. Something with a tail that curved like a scythe and limbs that moved with a deliberation that spoke of terrible intelligence. It was not attacking, it was watching, and in the seesaw roar that suddenly blared in Morgan's skull like a klaxon, he understood that he had been granted an audience, a moment of appraisal before the hunt began in earnest. He did not run. He could not run. His legs were locked, his nervous system flooded with the biological equivalent of a system error, and he stood transfixed as the shape withdrew into the cave mouth with a fluidity that belied its size, leaving only the echo of its movement and the lingering pressure of its attention, a weight on his chest that felt like the first touch of a creditor's hand, claiming what was owed. He found Harold Vance again the next morning, not at the veterinary office but at the Coldwater Diner, a greasy spoon on Main Street where the veterinarian sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the window with eyes that seemed to look through the glass into distances that were not geographical. Morgan slid into the opposite seat without asking permission, and Vance acknowledged him with a slight nod, as if he had been expecting this meeting, as if all their interactions were predetermined by the logic of the debt. "You saw her," Vance said. "It was not a question." "I saw something," Morgan replied, though the distinction felt meaningless. "On the cliffs. It didn't attack, it just watched." "She's sizing you up," Vance said, his voice flat, devoid of the manic energy he had displayed in the basement. "Deciding what you're worth. The mother doesn't waste energy on prey that can't sustain her. She calculates. She plans. That's what makes her so much worse than a simple predator. A wolf kills because it's hungry. The mother kills because it's optimal. Because the ledger demands balance." Morgan leaned forward, lowering his voice though the diner was nearly empty, The only other customers a pair of old men playing checkers in a booth near the door who seemed not to notice or care about the conversation. "I need to get into the caves," he said. "I need to see the nursery. I need to understand what's happening before it happens." Vance laughed, a dry, clicking sound that contained no humor. "Nobody goes into the caves, Mr. Hale, not anymore. The last person to go in was Jonas Coldwater in 1897, and he only came out because she let him come out. The caves are her body. The passages are her throat. You don't explore them. You don't survive them. You enter them and you become part of the system." "Nutrition. Then how do we stop it?" Morgan asked, desperation creeping into his voice despite his efforts at control. "The eggs, the hatchlings, the breach. How do we keep this from spreading beyond the hills?" Vance turned his head slowly, and in his eyes Morgan saw the answer before the veterinarian spoke it, saw the hopelessness that came from decades of living with a problem that had no solution, only management. "We don't," Vance said. "We can't. The mother has been here since before humans, before mammals, before anything that walked on land. She is part of the geology now, part of the calcium cycle, part of the water table. You don't stop a mountain, Mr. Hale. You don't stop a river. You channel it. You redirect it. You make sacrifices to keep it from flooding your fields. And when the flood comes anyway, as it always does, you hope that your particular farm is high enough to survive." He paused, his hand rising to his lips to wipe away a fleck of dried blood that Morgan had not noticed before. "But this time is different. The fracking didn't just breach the nursery. It changed the acoustics. The seesaw roar, the sonar, it's amplified now. The limestone transmits it further, faster. She can call her young from miles away, can coordinate them, can teach them to hunt before they even leave the shell. And they're learning fast, Mr. Hale. The one in my basement, I've been listening to it. It doesn't just click and scratch anymore. It speaks. It learns words from me. It calls me daddy in a voice that sounds like wet gravel being poured down a pipe. And when it hatches, when it finally tears its way out of that shell, it's going to know everything I know. It's going to know the town, the defenses, the weak points, and it's going to tell the others." Morgan felt the coffee in his stomach turn to acid. "Then why are you still here? Why haven't you taken your daughter and run?" Vance's hand trembled, spilling cold coffee across the table in a brown wash that spread toward Morgan's elbows. "Because I can't," he whispered. "Because the debt follows you, Mr. Hale. Because she knows my daughter's name, knows her face, knows the exact coordinates of her bedroom in this town or any other. Because running is just another way of entering the ledger, and the entry for runners is always comprehensive. No, I stay because staying is the only form of resistance I have left. I keep the egg alive because keeping it alive keeps my daughter breathing for one more day. And when the day comes that the egg hatches and the debt is called in full, I will do what fathers have done since 1897. I will open the door myself. I will lead them to the pantry. And I will hope that in the moment of my daughter's screaming, the mother will be merciful enough to take me instead." Morgan sat back, the weight of the veterinarian's confession settling over him like a shroud. He understood now that he was not merely investigating a story, but had become part of one, a character in a narrative that had been unfolding for generations with a momentum that no single act of will could arrest. He thought of the cliffs, of the shape against the stars, of the seesaw roar that still hummed in his bones like a second skeleton, and he knew that the time for observation was ending. The mother was moving, the eggs were maturing, and the perimeter that had held for a century was cracking under the pressure of modern intrusion. If he was going to act, if he was going to find some way to alter the trajectory of this story, it would have to be soon, and it would have to be deep, in the places where the light did not reach, and the debt was calculated in screams rather than currency. He left the diner without another word, Vance's cold eyes following him out the door, and as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt the afternoon sun on his face and understood, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, that he was standing in the last daylight he would ever see as a free man. The caves were waiting. The mother was listening, and the ledger was open, waiting for the next entry to be written in blood. The mining company was called Ozark Deep Resources, a subsidiary of a corporation based in Houston, whose executives had never set foot in Boone County, and whose understanding of the local geology came from satellite imagery and seismic surveys that measured the Earth as abstractions, waves and densities and fracture coefficients, stripped of the history that lived in the stone. Morgan found their field office in a double-wide trailer parked at the edge of the new clear-cut, a temporary structure that had acquired a patina of semi-permanence through months of occupancy. The ground around it churned to mud by heavy equipment and the detritus of industrial invasion. Empty fuel drums, discarded hard hats, coils of cable that gleamed with an obscene newness against the scarred earth. The site manager was a man named Doug Castellanos, late 30s, with the weathered skin and guarded eyes of someone who had spent his career translating between corporate directives and the resistant materiality of rock. He received Morgan with the weary suspicion of a man who had dealt with too many inspectors, activists, and reporters, but he agreed to talk when Morgan mentioned the historical significance of the site, spinning a story about documenting the 1897 posse for a heritage foundation that Castellanos clearly didn't believe, but found sufficiently non-threatening to tolerate. "We're not doing anything different from what they've been doing here for 100 years, Castellanos said, gesturing toward the sinkhole that Morgan recognized from his earlier visit, though it looked different in daylight, less menacing and more merely industrial, a wound in the earth that had been dressed with safety fencing and warning signs. Limestone extraction, some shale gas testing, standard operations. And the new breach, Morgan asked, keeping his voice neutral. The sinkhole that opened last month, Castellanos' jaw tightened, a tell that Morgan filed away for later consideration. Geological event, subsidence caused by groundwater shifts. Happens all the time in karst topography. I was here when it opened, Morgan lied, though the lie felt closer to truth than most of his honest statements. I heard something, from inside. For a long moment, Castellanos said nothing. He stared at the sinkhole with an expression that Morgan would later describe in his journal as the look of a man trying not to remember something. Then he turned and walked toward the trailer, gesturing for Morgan to follow. Inside, the trailer was cluttered with maps and core samples, the walls lined with photographs of the drilling operations, men in hard hats standing beside rigs that plunged into the earth like needles, cross-section diagrams showing the limestone layers in pastel colors, safety certificates and inspection reports that certified the operation as compliant with every applicable regulation. But it was the photograph in the corner, half hidden behind a calendar depicting offshore oil platforms, that caught Morgan's attention. It showed the inside of a cavern, illuminated by work lights that had been strung along a passage walls, and in the background, emerging from a darkness that the lights could not penetrate, was a shape. The photograph was blurry, taken in motion, the autofocus locking on the foreground equipment and leaving the background as a suggestion of mass and texture. But Morgan could see enough to recognize the curve of a tail, the suggestion of segmented plating, and above it all, 2 points of reflected light that might have been eyes or might have been the gleam of quartz deposits catching the artificial illumination. "That was taken 3 weeks ago," Castellanos said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the trailer's air conditioning. "We sent a survey team into the upper cavern to assess the stability after the subsidence. 4 men went in, 2 came out. The ones who came out there on medical leave, sedated mostly. They keep saying they heard something that made them walk toward it, made them want to walk toward it, even when they could see what was waiting. The company called it a gas leak. Hydrogen sulfide causes disorientation, hallucinations. But I was there when they came out, Mr. Hale. I saw their faces. I've seen men with hydrogen sulfide exposure. They vomit, they cry, they don't come out smiling. These men came out smiling, smiling like children who had seen their mother after a long absence." He turned away from the photograph, his hands shaking as he reached for a coffee cup that had been empty for hours. We're shutting down the operation. Officially, it's because of unforeseen geological instability. Unofficially, it's because the insurance company took one look at that photograph and threatened to cancel our entire policy. But shutting down doesn't matter now. Whatever we woke up, whatever we let see the sky, it's already awake. It's already seen. And it's not going back to sleep just because we stopped drilling. Morgan stared at the photograph, the shape in the darkness, and felt the seesaw roar in his head pulse in recognition, a harmonic resonance that suggested the creature in the image and the frequency in his skull were the same phenomenon expressed in different mediums. "I need to get in there," he said. "I need to see the upper cavern." Castellanos laughed, a harsh, barking sound that contained no humor. "You're as crazy as the rest of them. The company men, the scientists, the lunatics from town who keep coming out here with their salt and their iron and their prayers. You think you're going to find something in there. You think you're going to understand it. I think," Morgan said carefully, "that understanding is the only weapon we have. And I think that the longer we wait, the less time we have to use it." Castellano studied him for a long moment, his eyes reading something in Morgan's face that might have been recognition or might have been pity. Then he reached into a drawer and produced a key card, a plastic rectangle embossed with the Ozark Deep logo. "There's an access tunnel on the north face of the sinkhole. It was supposed to be a ventilation shaft for the lower extraction, but it connects to the cave network. The company sealed it last week, but the seal is just plywood and warning tape. If you're determined to die, Mr. Hale, that's your business. But I'm giving you this because maybe, someone who knows what they're looking at can do what the rest of us couldn't. Maybe you can figure out how to put it back to sleep." He pressed the keycard into Morgan's hand with a grip that felt like desperation. "One thing, if you hear the sound, the one that makes you want to walk toward it, don't fight it. Fighting makes it worse. Just let go, and maybe you'll wake up, maybe." Morgan spent the rest of that day preparing, though he was not sure what preparation was possible for a descent into the throat of the earth. He bought supplies at the hardware store in Coldwater: a headlamp, extra batteries, rope, a climbing harness, chalk for marking his path, and he returned to the motel to review his notes on the 1897 posse, searching for any detail that might serve as guidance or warning. The historical record was thin, a patchwork of newspaper accounts, oral histories collected by folklorists in the 1930s, and the single surviving document, the Journal of Jonah's Coldwater, which was housed in the state archives and available only as a microfilm reproduction that Morgan had studied until his eyes burned. He had dismissed the journal during his academic years as a fabrication, a piece of Gothic fiction composed by a man who had built his fortune on land speculation and needed a legend to inflate property values. But reading it now, with the seesaw roar humming in his skull and the memory of the shape on the cliffs fresh in his mind, Morgan found himself interpreting the text differently, reading between the lines for the truths that Coldwater had encoded in metaphor and euphemism. "We did not kill the beast," Coldwater had written in the final entry, dated October 14, 1897. "We could not kill what was never alive in the manner of earthly things. It is older than the stone, older than the water that carved these passages. It is the hollow itself made hungry, the throat that swallowed the world before light. We made a covenant with it, a substitution of lives for life, and it accepted our terms with a patience that terrifies me more than its teeth. I alone returned from the deep places, and I returned because I offered it a replacement. A prisoner from the county jail, a man named Ebenezer Crow, who had killed his wife and deserved no mercy. The beast took him, and in the taking I saw that it does not eat as we eat. It does not consume for sustenance but for something else, for memory, for history, for the accumulation of souls that gives it weight in the world. Crow is still down there, I am certain, still screaming in the belly of the hollow, and his screams are the foundation upon which our town is built. We have bought our safety with his eternal suffering, and the debt compounds with interest. I have done a terrible thing, and I will die with it on my conscience, but my children will live, and their children, and the covenant will hold as long as we are willing to pay. May God forgive us, for the hollow does not. Morgan read the passage 3 times, 4 times, his finger tracing the microfilm reproduction as if he could feel the texture of Coldwater's handwriting through the photographic negative. The false hope, he realized. The entire narrative of the 1897 posse as a heroic hunt was a lie constructed to conceal the truth of the Covenant, a myth of victory where the reality was one of negotiation and sacrifice. The survivors had not defeated the Gowrow. They had become its bankers, its creditors, its accomplices in a system of tribute that extended across generations. And Morgan understood with a clarity that made his stomach clench that he was reading not history but a manual, a guide to survival that offered only 2 paths, payment or consumption. He thought of Ebenezer Crow, of the prisoner offered as replacement, and he wondered how many others had followed him into the dark, how many lives had been balanced against the ledger of the town's continued existence. The numbers were impossible to calculate, but Morgan suspected they were higher than anyone admitted, that the occasional missing person Harold Vance had mentioned was in fact a regular tithe, a steady stream of humanity fed into the earth to maintain the fiction of safety. And now the system was breaking down, the fracking having disrupted the delicate equilibrium of terror and tribute, and the mother was preparing to collect not just interest but principal, not just individuals but the entire town, the entire county, perhaps the entire world if her young were numerous enough and hungry enough to range beyond the hills. He slept fitfully that night, his dreams filled with the sound of screaming that never stopped, a continuous note of agony that seemed to emanate from the bedrock itself. And he woke before dawn with the certain knowledge that today was the day he would enter the caves, that the preparation was complete, and the only thing left was the descent. He approached the access tunnel at first light, the sky a bruised purple that promised rain, but delivered only a thick, oppressive humidity that seemed to press the air against his skin like a wet cloth. The sinkhole looked different in the half-light, less like a geological feature, and more like a wound that had begun to heal wrong, the edges of the crater crusted with mineral deposits that gleamed with a phosphorescence that should not have been visible without a light source. The plywood seal that Castellanos had mentioned was indeed flimsy, a sheet of particle board nailed across a steel frame that had been welded to the tunnel mouth, and Morgan pried it loose with a crowbar from his car, the nails squealing as they withdrew from the limestone, with a sound that reminded him, disturbingly, of teeth being extracted. The tunnel beyond was dark, a throat of polished stone that descended at a steep angle into the earth, and Morgan felt the seesaw roar in his head increase in volume as he approached, not painfully but insistently, like a conversation partner who had been waiting for him to arrive. He activated his headlamp, the lead beam cutting a cone of white light into the darkness, and began to descend, his boots finding purchase on steps that had been carved into the stone by miners or by older, stranger hands. The air grew colder with each step, a chill that penetrated his clothing and settled into his joints with an arthritic persistence, and the smell of the caves enveloped him, not the clean scent of wet stone that he had expected, but a complex odor of decay and life intermingled, of fungus and ammonia and the copper sweetness of blood, and beneath it all, a deeper smell that he could only describe as mineral hunger, the scent of something that had been waiting so long in the dark that the darkness had become part of its metabolism. The tunnel wound downward in a spiral that seemed designed to disorient, each turn revealing a new stretch of identical stone that made Morgan's sense of progress dissolve into a dreamlike timelessness. He marked his path with chalk arrows, though the chalk seemed to fade almost as soon as he applied it, the damp stone absorbing the marks like a tongue licking clean a plate. After what felt like hours but might have been minutes, his watch had stopped at 6:47, the second hand frozen in a perpetual stutter. The tunnel opened into a chamber that took Morgan's breath away with its scale and its wrongness. It was vast, a cathedral of limestone that soared upward into darkness beyond the reach of his headlamp, the ceiling lost in a void that seemed to breathe with a slow, tidal rhythm. But it was the floor that held his attention, the floor and the walls, which were covered not in stalactites or flowstone, but in something organic, something that grew in pulsing clusters that emitted a faint bioluminescence, a sickly greenish glow that provided just enough illumination to reveal the contours of the space without dispelling its shadows. The clusters were eggs, he realized, dozens of them, hundreds, ranging in size from basketballs to the massive beer keg dimensions of the one in Harold Vance's basement. They were packed against the walls in layered rows, stacked like masonry, their leathery surfaces veined with vessels that pulsed with the same arrhythmic beat he had felt in Vance's egg. And the chamber itself was warm, unnaturally warm, heated by some geothermal source that seemed localized, as if the earth itself were incubating these monstrous seeds with a maternal attention that mocked human conceptions of nurture. Morgan stood at the threshold of the chamber, his light playing across the egg clusters, and he understood that he was standing in the nursery, the breeding ground of a species that had no place in any taxonomy, and that the mother was not merely a creature but a system, a reproductive strategy encoded in stone and time, a predator that had solved the problem of survival not through competition, but through cultivation, through the domestication of an entire ecosystem that served as both womb and larder. The eggs nearest to him shifted, a rustling like dry leaves in wind, and Morgan stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs, as one of the smaller eggs cracked along its equator, a fissure widening with a wet tearing sound to reveal the thing inside. It was not like the shape he had seen on the cliffs, not the armored-tailed monster of legend, but something more primitive, more larval, a pale, segmented worm with limbs that were still forming, a head that was mostly mouth, and eyes, dozens of eyes, that opened simultaneously to regard him with a curiosity that was more terrible than hostility. The hatchling made a sound, a wet clicking that matched the frequency of the seesaw roar, and Morgan felt his legs begin to move forward, drawn by a biological imperative that overrode his conscious terror, his body responding to a signal that his ancestors had evolved to obey, the ancient reflex of prey toward predator, the hypnotized bird toward the snake. He bit his tongue hard, the pain jolting him out of the trance, and he stumbled backward, away from the hatching, away from the nursery, his headlamp beam swinging wildly across the chamber to reveal other movements, other cracks forming in the egg walls, other pale things beginning to stir in the warmth of the deep earth. He ran, not caring about the noise, not caring about the chalk marks that had faded to nothing, not caring about anything but escape, and the tunnel that had been a spiral descent became a labyrinth of branching passages, each one identical to the last, each one breathing with the warmth of incubation and the smell of things being born. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook, until the headlamp dimmed and the darkness pressed against him like a physical weight, and still the passages continued, still the eggs clustered against the walls, still the clicking followed him like a laughter that had no humor in it, only appetite. He did not know how long he ran, or how far, or in what direction. Time in the caves was not a river but a lake, still and deep and without current, and Morgan was drowning in it, thrashing toward a surface that receded with each stroke. And then, just as his legs were about to give way, just as the darkness was about to claim him entirely, he saw something ahead. A light not his own, a flickering yellow glow that suggested fire or candle rather than electric illumination. And with the last of his strength, he stumbled toward it, bursting through a narrow passage into a space that was different from the nursery, older and smaller and somehow more human, though the humanity was distant, a memory of habitation rather than the thing itself. It was a room, roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, its walls blackened by smoke and carved with symbols that Morgan did not recognize, but that hurt his eyes to look at directly, as if they were designed to be perceived at the edge of vision rather than in focus. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, a slab of dark rock that had been worn smooth by decades or centuries of use. And on the altar lay the remains of a fire, cold ashes that held the shape of their last burning like a memory of heat. And around the altar, arranged in a semicircle, were the journals. Morgan approached them with a reverence that he could not explain, his hands shaking as he lifted the nearest one, a leather-bound volume whose cover had been cured to the consistency of bark, its pages filled with handwriting that spanned generations. The first entries were in a hand he recognized from the microfilm, Jonah Coldwater's precise, antique script, but subsequent pages had been added by others, by descendants and successors, by men and women who had inherited the responsibility of the covenant and recorded their payments in a ledger of blood that was more detailed than any account book. Morgan read, his headlamp casting stark shadows across the pages, and the history of the town unfolded before him in a chronicle of systematic atrocity. 1854, delivered to the Hollow one convict, name of Thomas Blackwell, guilty of horse theft. The beast accepted the offering and withdrew for 7 years. 1861, war years, unable to provide human tribute, sacrificed 12 head of cattle. The beast accepted but demanded double when peace returned. 1868, delivered 2 orphans from the county poorhouse. The beast accepted, withdrew for 10 years. 1889, drought year. Livestock insufficient. Delivered the widow Mercer who had no family to miss her. The beast accepted but required that her screams be heard in the town square as warning. The entries continued, decade after decade, each one a cold record of lives offered and accepted, of the delicate accounting that kept the town safe and the Hollow fed. Morgan felt his sanity fraying as he read, the dispassionate tone of the record keepers somehow more horrifying than any description of violence could have been. The implication that these sacrifices had become routine, bureaucratic, as ordinary as paying taxes or repairing roads. And then he found the entries for 1897, the year of the posse, and the truth was laid bare in Jonah Coldwater's own hand. The beast has emerged from the deep places in greater numbers than before. Not one but many, a clutch that has matured in the warm years. The old tribute is insufficient. The posse was formed not to kill but to distract, to lead the young ones on a chase while I descended to negotiate with the mother. 19 men died in the caves, their screams echoing through the town for 3 days. I emerged with the new terms, annual tribute, specific quantities, specific qualities. The covenant is rewritten. The debt is renewed. And I have placed upon my descendants the burden of ensuring payment, generation after generation, until the Hollow itself is filled and the beast can eat no more. Morgan closed the journal, his hands trembling, and understood the false hope completely. The posse had not been heroes. They had been bait, and the survivors had not been victorious. They had been accountants, bookkeepers of atrocity, managers of a debt that could never be fully paid. He looked around the room, at the symbols on the walls, at the altar with its cold ashes, and he realized that he was standing in the heart of the covenant, the place where the town's leaders had come for generations to record their payments and receive their instructions. A church without God, where the congregation worshipped at the altar of survival at any cost. And he understood, too, that he was not the first outsider to find this place, that others had stumbled into the caves over the decades, drawn by curiosity or desperation or the same biological sonar that now hummed in his own skull, and that their fates were recorded in the later pages of the journals, not as tributes but as discoveries, as threats to the system that had been eliminated with the same efficiency that characterized the culling of livestock. He found his own name before he realized he was looking for it, a recent entry in a hand he did not recognize, perhaps Harold Vance's or another caretaker's. Morgan Hale, historian, arrived in Coldwater on assignment, has seen the mother on the cliffs, has heard the call. The debt is being calculated. He will enter the caves or the caves will take him. Either way, the ledger balances. The entry was dated 3 days ago. Morgan had not yet told anyone he was going into the caves. The realization that his movements had been predicted, accounted for, entered into the Covenant's record before he had conceived of them himself, sent a bolt of pure terror through him that momentarily cleared the fog of the caves, and he staggered backward, dropping the journal, his headlamp beam swinging wildly across the walls to reveal something he had not noticed before. The room was not empty. In the shadows behind the altar, arranged in rows like pews in a church, sat the dead. They were dried, desiccated, preserved by the cave's constant temperature and humidity into mummies that still wore the clothing of their respective eras. A Union uniform from the Civil War, a Depression-era suit, a polyester jacket from the 1970s, and newer clothes, fresher corpses, including one that wore the fluorescent vest of an Ozark Deep Resources survey team. Their faces were frozen in expressions of rapture rather than fear, their mouths open in smiles that had been preserved by the drying of their tissues, their eyes, those that remained, staring upward at the darkness with an adoration that was more terrible than any scream. Morgan understood, with a nausea that rose in his throat like bile, that these were the replacements, the prisoners and orphans and outsiders who had been offered to the mother, not killed but kept, preserved in a state of eternal worship, their bodies retained as evidence of the Covenant's fulfillment while their souls, or whatever the mother consumed, were digested in the dark below. He backed toward the passage he had entered through, his hands outstretched to feel for the walls, his headlamp dying now, the LED flickering as the batteries succumbed to the damp. And as the light failed, he heard the sound that he had been dreading since he first set foot in Coldwater, the seesaw roar, not in his head this time but in the air around him, filling the chamber with a pressure that made his ears pop and his vision flash with patterns of light that had no source. And in the roar, he heard something else, a new frequency, higher and more insistent, the sound of many small throats learning to make the same call, the sound of the hatchlings in the nursery tuning themselves to the mother's voice, preparing to hunt. He ran again, blindly now, the darkness complete, his hands trailing along the walls to guide him, the texture of the stone changing from rough limestone to something smoother, something that felt almost organic under his fingertips, as if the passages themselves were not geological features but tissues, the throat of the hollow contracting around him with peristaltic purpose. The roar followed, always behind him, always ahead, a three-dimensional sound that had no fixed origin, and beneath it, the clicking of claws on stone, the wet slap of webbed feet against wet rock, the sounds of pursuit that were not frantic but deliberate, a predator herding prey toward a destination that had been chosen long before the chase began. Morgan's lungs burned, his muscles screamed, his mind fragmented into a series of animal impulses. Run, hide, freeze, fight, each one overridden by the next in a cascade of terror that left no room for thought, for planning, for the rational strategies that had served him in the abandoned buildings and tunnels of his urban exploring career. This was different. This was not a space designed by humans for human purposes, altered by decay but fundamentally comprehensible. This was a space designed by something else for something else's purposes, and Morgan was not an explorer here but an intruder, a foreign body being expelled through the digestive system of the earth itself. The passage narrowed, the walls pressing against his shoulders, then his chest, then compressing to a squeeze that forced him to exhale and slide through with his arms stretched above his head, his face scraping against stone that smelled of ammonia and old blood. He emerged into a space that was instantly familiar despite his terror, the chamber of eggs, the nursery, though he had run in what he believed was the opposite direction, had descended further and further only to find himself back at the beginning, the labyrinth having no center or circumference, but only the endless recursion of prey toward predator. The eggs were hatching now, dozens of them, the air filled with the wet tearing of membranes and the high, piping cries of things being born. And in the bioluminescence of the broken shells, Morgan saw the hatchlings clearly for the first time. They were pale, yes, but not the pallor of weakness. They were the white of new teeth, of fresh bone, of things that had never seen the sun and did not need to. Their bodies were segmented like centipedes, each segment bearing a pair of limbs that were simultaneously legs and arms, ending in claws that clicked against the stone with a sound like dice being shaken in a cup. Their heads were elongated, snake-like, with jaws that unhinged to reveal rows of transparent needles, and their eyes were the color of the mother's, reflectors that caught the faint light and threw it back in doubled intensity, each one a small lantern in the darkness. They moved with a coordination that suggested hive intelligence, their bodies flowing around the eggs in streams that converged and diverged with fluid precision. And as Morgan stood frozen at the chamber's edge, they turned as one to regard him, their clicking falling silent, their attention focusing with a physical weight that pressed against his skin like a hand. He expected them to attack, to swarm him with the mindless ferocity of newborn predators, but they did not. They watched, their heads tilting in unison, their jaws working with a chewing motion that produced no sound, and Morgan understood that they were learning, downloading information from the mother's sonar, assessing him as a threat or a resource, calculating the optimal use of this new variable in their environment. The roar shifted, a modulation in frequency that made Morgan's knees buckle, and the hatchlings responded, their bodies aligning in a formation that was almost military, a vanguard and flanks and a reserve, a hunting strategy that had been transmitted through sound rather than instinct. They were being taught, he realized. The mother was using him as a lesson, a practical demonstration for her young in the art of herding, of controlling, of breaking the will of prey before the consumption began. And he understood, too, that his death would not be quick, that the mother did not simply eat but used, that his body would serve as nourishment and his screams as instruction. His final hours stretched into an eternity of pedagogical suffering for the benefit of the next generation. The hatchlings advanced, not rushing but flowing, a tide of pale segments and clicking claws that surrounded him without touching, pressing close enough that he could smell their breath, ammonia and copper, the same scent as the caves, and feel the heat of their metabolisms, the feverish warmth of things that had been incubated in volcanic temperatures and now radiated that heat into the cooler air of the chamber. Morgan closed his eyes, the terror having transcended the capacity for physical response, his body gone limp with a surrender that was not courage but exhaustion, the final stages of a prey animal that has run too far and can run no further. He waited for the first bite, the first tear of flesh, the beginning of the lesson. But the attack did not come. Instead, the roar changed again, a harsh, commanding note that made the hatchlings flinch and withdraw, their bodies recoiling into the shadows between the eggs with a speed that suggested fear rather than obedience. The chamber grew colder, the warmth of the hatchlings dissipating as they retreated, and Morgan felt a new presence enter the space, a displacement of air that carried with it a smell older than the caves, older than the limestone, a smell that spoke of deep time and hungrier gravity. He opened his eyes, though every instinct screamed at him to keep them closed, to deny the final image entry into his consciousness, and he saw her. The mother, the Gowrow, the thing that had been called by many names across many years but answered to none, because naming implies a relationship of equals, and this thing had never been equal to anything that walked or swam or flew on the earth. She filled the chamber, though the chamber was vast, her body extending into the darkness beyond the reach of the bioluminescence, segments and plates and bristling fur that moved with a deliberation that suggested mass measured in tons rather than pounds. Her head was crocodilian, elongated and armored, with a jaw that could have swallowed a man whole without unhinging. But it was her eyes that held Morgan's attention, eyes the size of dinner plates, reflectors that caught the faint light and threw it back with an intelligence that was not human but was not animal either. A cold, calculating awareness that assessed him as a bookkeeper might assess a column of figures, with interest but without passion. She had a tail, he saw, though it was mostly hidden in the darkness. A tail that curved like a question mark and ended in a blade of bone or chitin that gleamed with an edge finer than any razor. A tail that had carved the limestone passages over millennia, trimming them to her specifications, shaping the caves into a maze that served her hunting strategies. And beneath her body, protected by plates that opened like the segments of an armadillo, he glimpsed the belly pouch, the marsupial pocket where her young completed their development, where the hatchlings that were too weak to survive outside would cling to her warmth and nurse on her secretions until they were ready to join the hunt. The pouch was moving, he saw, the plates flexing as something inside shifted, and from within came a sound that was almost mewling, almost human, the cry of young things that had not yet learned to be monsters. The mother regarded Morgan with her terrible eyes, and the seesaw roar built in his skull until he thought his head would split, until blood began to trickle from his nose and ears, until his vision blurred with the pressure of a sound that was not sound but a direct manipulation of his nervous system. And in that roar, he heard words, or the approximation of words, concepts forced into syllables by a mind that had never evolved for speech, but had learned to use sound as a scalpel, cutting into the prey brain to extract compliance. You came, the roar said, though it was not language but a pattern of frequencies that his auditory cortex interpreted as meaning. You heard the call. You entered the throat. You are in the ledger now. Morgan tried to speak, to bargain, to offer something. Information, service, worship. But his vocal cords were paralyzed by the roar, his body locked in a posture of submission that was encoded in his DNA. The ancient reflex of a mammal confronting an apex predator that had been hunting his kind since before the ice ages. The mother advanced, her webbed feet slapping against the stone with a sound that echoed from multiple directions, creating a spatial confusion that made it impossible to track her movement, her body seeming to be everywhere at once, filling the chamber with the smell of her breath, the heat of her metabolism, the weight of her attention. She lowered her head until her snout was inches from Morgan's face, her jaws opening to reveal teeth that were not teeth but crystalline formations, mineral growths that had accreted over centuries into serrated ridges capable of shearing bone like paper. She did not bite. She inhaled, a long, slow breath that drew the air past Morgan's face with a suction that made his hair stand on end, and he understood that she was tasting him, sampling his chemical signature, determining his nutritional value and his strategic utility. The breath was cold, impossibly cold, a refrigerator chill that seemed to freeze the moisture in his nostrils and leave a rime of frost on his eyelashes. And when she exhaled, the warmth of her metabolic exhaust enveloped him, a cyclical temperature fluctuation that disoriented him further, making his body unable to calibrate its own internal thermostat. She was studying him, he realized, the way a chef might study an ingredient, determining the best preparation, the optimal use, the most efficient extraction of value. And as she studied, the hatchlings watched from the shadows, their eyes reflecting her light in a constellation of small lanterns, learning from her example the proper technique for handling prey, the patience that allowed the predator to control the moment of death rather than surrendering to the frenzy of hunger. The roar modulated, a softer note that might have been inquiry or might have been mockery, and Morgan felt a pressure in his mind, a sensation like fingers probing through the tissue of his thoughts, sorting through his memories and fears and desires with a clinical detachment that was more violating than any physical penetration could have been. She was reading him, he understood, accessing the database of his consciousness as easily as he might access a library catalog, and what she found there seemed to satisfy her, for the pressure withdrew, the roar softened to a hum that was almost maternal, almost comforting, and her head withdrew slightly to allow him a moment of relative oxygen, a brief reprieve before the next stage of the process. You have value, the roar informed him, the frequencies resolving into meaning with a clarity that made his stomach clench. You have knowledge of the surface, of the people, of the old debts and the new. You can be used. You can be kept. Morgan felt the tears on his face freeze in the cold of her breath, his body shaking with a terror that had transcended the physical and entered the realm of the existential, the fear not of death, but of consumption, of being incorporated into a system so vast and so ancient that his individual existence would be erased without trace, his screams absorbed into the geological record as meaningless as the compression of a seashell into limestone. Or you can be eaten, the roar continued, the modulation shifting to a note that was almost seductive, almost loving. The ledger accepts all currencies. Flesh is the simplest payment, but flesh is finite. Knowledge is compound interest. Service is eternal. Choose. Morgan understood the choice, understood it with the clarity of a man who stands at a crossroads where both paths lead into darkness, but one offers the illusion of agency. He could die now in this chamber, his body torn apart by the mother's jaws or fed to the hatchlings as a graduation exercise, his death quick or slow depending on her pedagogical needs. Or he could serve, could become part of the covenant, could take his place alongside Harold Vance and Jonah's Coldwater, and all the others who had traded their humanity for a few more years of breathing, who had accepted the terms of the debt and become its enforcers, its accountants, its priests. The choice was not a choice at all, for Morgan had already made it the moment he entered the caves, the moment he heard the roar and did not run, the moment he allowed curiosity to override survival instinct. He was already in the ledger. The only question was the terms of repayment. Service, he tried to say, though his vocal cords would not obey, the word emerging as a croak that might have been assent or might have been a final protest. I will serve. The mother regarded him for a long moment, her reflector eyes unblinking, and then the roar shifted to a frequency that was not for him, but for the hatchlings, a command that sent them scurrying back to their eggs, their lessons concluded for the moment, their appetites deferred. She turned, her massive body moving with a fluidity that defied her bulk, and began to withdraw into the darkness, her tail trailing behind her like a scythe being dragged across stone, the sound of it echoing through the chamber and the passages beyond. But before she disappeared, she paused, her head turning back to regard Morgan one final time, and the roar returned, a single pulse of sound that was not a word but a brand, a frequency that burned itself into his auditory cortex like a cattle iron, marking him as property, as servant, as debt slave to the hollow. Follow, the brand commanded. The ledge awaits. The others are there. The reckoning is near. And then she was gone, the darkness closing around her like water around a stone, and Morgan was alone in the nursery with the hatchlings and the eggs and the bioluminescence that pulsed with a rhythm that matched his own racing heart. He stood for a long time, his body trembling, his mind trying to process what had happened, what he had agreed to, what he had become. The tears on his face had melted, running in warm tracks down his frozen skin, and he wiped them away with hands that seemed to belong to someone else, someone who had made a different choice, who had died in the light rather than survived in the dark. But he was alive, and the brand in his skull pulsed with a steady beat that was not his heartbeat but the mother's, a synchronization of rhythms that tied him to her will with a cord of sound that could stretch across miles, across years, across the barrier between the surface and the deep. He was hers now, and she had work for him. He began to walk, following the brand's directional pull, moving through passages that seemed to open before him, the stone yielding to his passage in a way it had not before, as if the caves themselves recognized his new status and adjusted their topology to accommodate him. He did not know where he was going, but the brand knew, and his body followed its instructions with the compliance of a puppet, his consciousness a passenger in a vehicle that had changed drivers. The passages sloped upward, gradually, and the air grew colder, then warmer, then cold again in cycles that suggested he was passing through different zones of the mother's territory, different rooms in the house of the hollow. The eggs thinned, then disappeared, replaced by bare stone that had been polished smooth by centuries of passage. And Morgan realized that he was moving toward the surface, toward the entrance to Devil's Hole proper, the place where the 1897 posse had entered, and where the modern breach had opened a new door between the world of light and the world of teeth. The brand pulsed faster, an urgency that communicated itself to his muscles, making him move faster, climb steeper, until he was crawling on hands and knees through a passage that was barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders, the stone pressing against him from all sides in a claustrophobic embrace that would have triggered panic if he had been capable of panic anymore. And then, suddenly, the passage opened, and Morgan found himself on a ledge, a narrow shelf of limestone that projected from the cliff face like a tongue protruding from a mouth, and below him, visible in the starlight that filtered through the cave mouth, was a scene that made him press himself against the wall and try, uselessly, to become part of the stone. He was not alone on the ledge. There were others, a dozen men in hard hats and reflective vests, the surviving miners and surveyors from Ozark Deep Resources who had been drawn into the caves by the same roar that had captured Morgan, who had made the same choice, or had it made for them, who now stood in a line along the ledge like passengers waiting for a train that would never arrive. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge each other. They simply stood, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the starlight with the same flat intensity that Morgan had seen in the cattle, the same conditioned compliance that spoke of nervous systems reprogrammed by a signal they could not resist. And below them, in the cavern that opened beneath the ledge like a vast amphitheater, was the mother. She was fully visible here, her body illuminated by a phosphorescence that emanated from her own tissues, a cold blue-green glow that outlined her against the darkness in a silhouette of impossible scale. She was larger than Morgan had perceived in the nursery, larger than any creature had a right to be. Her body coiled through the cavern in loops and curves that suggested she could fill the entire space if she chose to extend herself fully. Her head rested on a promontory of rock opposite the ledge, her jaws slightly open, her breath creating clouds of condensation in the cold cave air, and her tail, her terrible blade-tipped tail, was in motion, sweeping back and forth across the cavern floor with a precision that was almost delicate, trimming the edges of the rock, carving new channels in the stone, shaping the environment to her specifications with the same care that Harold Vance had applied to scrubbing the egg. The hatchlings were here too, dozens of them, crawling over her body like ticks on a dog, their pale segments gleaming in her phosphorescence, their eyes tracking the movements of the tail with the avid attention of students watching a master demonstration. And in the center of the cavern, arranged in a circle of salt and ash that had been scattered by the mother's movements but still retained enough potency to create a visible boundary, were the newcomers. Morgan recognized some of them: the clerk from the courthouse, the old man from the bench outside the hardware store, a child he had seen playing in one of the salt circles on a farm. They were not dead, not yet, but they were frozen in postures of rapture that mirrored the mummies in the chamber below, their faces turned upward toward the mother with expressions of adoration that made Morgan want to scream, to tear his eyes out, to do anything to avoid seeing what humans looked like when they had been fully claimed by the debt. The mother lifted her head, the movement creating a displacement of air that blew Morgan's hair back from his face, and the seesaw roar filled the cavern, not painful now but omnipresent, a medium in which they all swam, a frequency that had become as natural as gravity. The roar carried meaning, instructions, a broadcast that was received not by ears but by bones, by the crystalline structures of the inner ear, by the piezoelectric tissues that lined the sinuses and detected vibrations below the threshold of hearing. And the meaning was clear, unmistakable, terrible. The debt is due. The young are hungry. The old covenant is broken by the intruders from above, the ones who cracked the earth with their machines and woke the sleepers. New terms are required, new payments. The perimeter will fall. The town will be consumed. And you, my servants, my debtors, will open the doors. You will lead them to the pantry. You will watch and you will learn, and you will be spared for another season. This is the covenant renewed. This is the ledger balanced. This is the hollow's throat swallowing the world. The men on the ledge moved as one, stepping forward to the edge, their bodies poised to fall, not in suicide but in offering, in submission, in the final act of incorporation that would make them part of the mother's system forever. Morgan felt his own feet moving, his body joining the line, the brand in his skull overriding his conscious resistance with a force that was not violent but inevitable, the gravity of a larger body pulling him into orbit. He teetered on the edge, the void below filled with teeth and light and the terrible beauty of a predator that had never known mercy, and he understood that this was the end, not of his life but of his humanity, the moment when he would become what Harold Vance had become, what Jonah's Coldwater had become, a creature that served the hollow because the alternative was to be consumed by it. The mother opened her jaws, the crystalline teeth parting to reveal a darkness deeper than the cave, a throat that extended into dimensions that Morgan's brain refused to process, and the roar crested, a wave of sound that lifted the men from the ledge and cast them down. Not as bodies falling but as offerings being placed, and Morgan felt himself tipping, felt the brand commanding his muscles to surrender to the fall, felt the air rushing past his face as he joined the others in the descent toward the final consumption. But the fall did not end in teeth. It ended in water, a pool of subterranean cold that broke his momentum with a shock that drove the air from his lungs and sent him plunging downward into darkness that was absolute, a blackness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed it. He thrashed, disoriented, his headlamp long dead, his body tumbling in currents that seemed to move in directions that physics did not permit, spiraling downward and sideways simultaneously, the water filling his mouth and nose with a mineral taste that was not water but something thicker, something that coated his throat and filled his stomach with a weight that was not drowning but digestion. And then his feet touched bottom, or what his feet interpreted as bottom, a surface that yielded like flesh under his boots, and he pushed upward, breaking through into air that was not air but gas, a pocket of atmosphere that stank of methane and rot and the same mineral hunger that permeated the caves. He gasped, vomiting the fluid from his lungs, his hands finding purchase on a surface that was warm and slick and alive, and he realized, with a clarity that cut through his terror like a blade, that he was not in water at all but in something else, something that the mother used to preserve her prey, a sack of amniotic fluid that maintained the victims in a state of suspended animation, their bodies kept fresh for consumption while their minds were broken by the roar and the dark. He was inside her, he realized, inside the belly pouch that he had glimpsed beneath her plated segments, and the warmth around him was her metabolism, the slickness was her secretions, the beating that surrounded him on all sides was her heart, or hearts, pumping fluid through a system that had no regard for his individual existence. The other men were here too, he sensed, though he could not see them, could feel them only as presences in the darkness, their breathing synchronized with his own, their heartbeats falling into rhythm with the mother's pulse, a choir of the consumed that sang in the key of submission. He tried to move, to find an exit, a way back to the surface, but the pouch contracted around him, the muscles of her abdomen flexing to hold him in place, and the roar returned not from outside but from within, transmitted through the fluid that surrounded him, through the tissues that pressed against him, a sound that had become indistinguishable from his own thoughts. Rest, the roar commanded. Grow. Become. And despite his terror, despite his desperate need to escape, Morgan felt his body responding, his muscles relaxing, his breathing slowing, his mind sinking into a state that was not sleep but something deeper, something that approached the suspension of the mummies in the chamber below, a preservation of function without the urgency of consciousness. He fought it, using the last of his will to maintain a thread of awareness, a single point of light in the darkness that was the memory of who he had been, what he had valued, the daughter he did not have but might have had if his life had followed a different path, the love he had never found because he had been too busy chasing stories into the dark. He clung to that light, that memory, that fragment of self, and the mother's contraction eased, as if she sensed his resistance and found it interesting, worth preserving rather than crushing. The fluid around him shifted, carrying him through her body, through passages that were not geological but biological, and he emerged finally into a space that was larger, that had walls of stone rather than flesh, though the stone was warm and pulsed with a rhythm that matched the mother's heartbeat. He was in another chamber, he realized, one of the upper caverns near the surface, and he was not alone. The others were here too, the men from the ledge, emerging from similar sacks that had been deposited in pools along the chamber floor, their bodies slick with the mother's secretions, their eyes open but unseeing, their movements robotic and synchronized. They were being changed, he saw, their skin taking on a pallor that matched the hatchlings, their fingers lengthening, their joints becoming more flexible, more segmented, as if the mother's fluids were not merely preserving them but transforming them, preparing them for a new role in her ecology. Morgan looked at his own hands and saw the same changes beginning, the skin translucent, the veins visible as dark lines beneath the surface, the nails thickening and yellowing into something that resembled claws. He was becoming, he realized, one of her servants in truth, not merely a debtor but a physical extension of her will, a creature that could walk on the surface and lead others to the pantry, that could maintain the covenant in ways that no purely human agent could manage. The brand in his skull pulsed, approving, guiding, and Morgan felt a new emotion rising through the terror, an emotion that was not hope but something more insidious, something that felt like acceptance, like relief, like the peace that comes from surrendering responsibility to a power greater than oneself. He was hers. He would serve. And in serving, he would survive, not as Morgan Hale but as something else, something that wore his face and spoke with his voice but served the hollow with a loyalty that transcended death. He stood, his new body moving with a fluidity that was not his own, and joined the others in their synchronized march toward the surface, toward the town, toward the covenant renewed. The passage ahead was lit now, not by headlamps or bioluminescence, but by a glow that emanated from their own transformed skin, a light that marked them as property, as agents, as the teeth of the hollow extended into the world of daylight. Morgan walked, and the brand sang in his skull, and the last vestige of his humanity retreated to a corner of his mind where it would wait, perhaps forever, for a rescue that would never come. They emerged from Devil's Hole proper, the entrance that the tourists visited, the opening in the cliff face that was large enough to drive a truck through, that had been mapped and photographed and designated as a natural wonder by the State Park Service. The morning sun was blinding, a white explosion that made Morgan's new eyes water and his transformed skin prickle with a sensitivity that was almost pain. He had never appreciated the sun before, had taken it for granted as a constant, but now he understood it as an enemy, a force that exposed him, that made his pale flesh vulnerable, that dried the mother's secretions on his skin and left him feeling raw and incomplete. The others felt it too, he sensed, their movements slowing, their bodies hunching as if to protect themselves from the light, and they clustered in the shadow of the cliff, waiting for dusk, waiting for the safety of darkness that was their natural medium now. But the brand pulsed, urgent, commanding, and Morgan understood that they were not to wait, that the mother had accelerated her timeline, that the old rhythms of night hunting were being replaced by something more aggressive, more desperate, a final push to secure the territory before the surface world could organize a response. They moved down the trail from Devil's Hole, past the parking lot where a single ranger vehicle sat empty, its driver presumably drawn into the caves by the same roar that had claimed Morgan, and onto the county road that led toward Coldwater. They walked in a line, not speaking, their movements synchronized by the brand that linked them to the mother's will. And as they walked, Morgan felt the last of his resistance dissolving, the final barriers between his human memories and his new purpose crumbling like ash. He thought of Harold Vance, of the egg in the basement, of the daughter who slept upstairs unaware that her father had already become something else. And he understood that the veterinarian was not waiting for him, but was already part of this procession, already marching toward the town with his own transformed body and his own brand singing in his skull. The debt was being called in full, not just for individuals but for the entire covenant, the entire system of tribute that had sustained itself for generations through the complicity of the living and the silence of the dead. And Morgan, walking with his new limbs and his new loyalty, understood that he was not a victim but a vector, not an ending but a beginning, the first wave of an invasion that would not stop until the hollow had consumed everything within reach, until the ledger was balanced not in lives but in ecosystems, in the total incorporation of the surface into the deep. The town appeared on the horizon, its water tower visible first, then the brick buildings of Main Street, then the iron fences and salt circles of the outlying farms, and Morgan felt the brand pulse with recognition, with hunger, with the terrible joy of a creditor come to collect. The seesaw roar rose around him, no longer in his skull but in the air, a physical sound that shook the windows of the houses and made the cattle in their pens bellow with panic, a sound that was not a warning but an announcement, not a threat but a promise. The hollow's throat was opening. The debt was due. And Morgan Hale, historian, disgraced academic, failed debunker, walked toward the town with his transformed brothers, his mouth opening in a cry that was not human, his hands reaching for the iron fences that would not hold, the salt circles that would not protect, the doors that would open to him because he wore the face of a man they knew, a man they might once have trusted, a man who had become the mouth of the monster he had sought to expose. The screaming began as they crossed the first fence, as the transformed touched the living, as the covenant was fulfilled in a way that no generation had foreseen. And Morgan screamed too, though whether in horror or in triumph even he could no longer say, for the brand had consumed him entirely now, and the last light of his humanity had gone out in the darkness of the hollow, leaving only the teeth, and the hunger and the endless, swallowing throat. But the story does not end with Morgan's fall, nor with the consumption of cold water, nor with the screams that echoed through the Ozark Hills for 7 days and 7 nights before falling silent. The story ends where it began, in a basement that smells of bleach and salt and the copper sweetness of things being born, with a man who is still, against all odds, scrubbing an egg that has begun to crack. Harold Vance has not joined the procession. Harold Vance has not answered the brand's call, because Harold Vance made a different covenant, a smaller, more desperate bargain, not with the mother but with the thing inside the shell, the hatchling that has learned his voice, his words, his love. As the town above screams, as the transformed servants of the hollow break down doors and drag the living into the streets, Harold sits in his basement and hums his lullaby, and the egg pulses in time with his heart, and the crack widens, and a pale segmented limb emerges, testing the air, finding his hand, wrapping around his fingers with a grip that is not hostile but grateful, a child reaching for its father in the moment of birth. "Daddy," the hatchling says, its voice like wet gravel, like old lullabies, like the sound of teeth being brushed. "Daddy, I'm hungry." "I know," Harold whispers, his tears falling onto the leathery shell, his other hand stroking the segmented limb with a tenderness that has survived even this. "I know, little one, but we don't eat family, we don't eat the ones who love us. That's the new covenant. That's the debt I pay." He reaches into his pocket and produces a knife, not for the hatchling but for himself, and he draws the blade across his wrist with a precision born of veterinary training, of decades of knowing exactly where the vein runs, how deep to cut, how much to give. The blood wells, dark and rich, and the hatchling makes a sound that is almost a coo, almost a song, And it feeds, its mouth finding the wound, its transparent needles piercing his skin, with a delicacy that is more intimate than any sexual act Harold has known. He holds it, this child of the hollow, this monster that is also his salvation, and he feels his daughter's footsteps upstairs, her panicked breathing as she hears the screams from the town, her hand on the basement door that he has locked from the outside, protecting her from what he has become and what he has made. The hatchling feeds and Harold fades, and the lullaby becomes a whisper, becomes a breath, becomes the last sound he makes before the darkness takes him. But in the moment before death, he feels the hatchling's mind touch his own, a pulse of gratitude, of love, of a promise that transcends species and hunger. And he knows that the new covenant holds, that his daughter will live, that the hatchling that fed on his flesh will protect her from the others, will lead her through the screaming streets to the caves where the mother cannot reach, where the debt is different, where the ledger has been rewritten in a father's blood. The egg splits open fully, and the hatchling emerges, pale and perfect and terrible, and it stands over Harold's body with a posture that is almost mourning, almost worship, and then it turns toward the stairs, toward the door, toward the world that is burning above, and it moves with a speed that the mother's children do not possess, a speed born of singular purpose, of love that has been twisted by biology into something that protects rather than consumes. It finds the daughter cowering in her bedroom, her face streaked with tears, her mouth open in a scream that dies when she sees the thing that has broken through the door. And for a moment they regard each other, human and monster, prey and predator, and the hatchling tilts its head in a gesture that is almost human, almost Harold, and it extends a pale limb in invitation. The daughter takes it. She does not know why. Perhaps it is the eyes, which are not reflectors but something softer, something that holds a memory of the man who gave his life to create this bridge between worlds. Perhaps it is the lullaby, which the hatchling hums in a voice like wet gravel, a voice that sounds like home. Or perhaps it is simply that in a world where everything is being consumed, where the hollow's throat has opened to swallow the last light, the only choice that remains is to choose the monster that knows your name, the debt that is personal, the covenant that is written in love rather than fear. She takes the hatchling's limb, and it leads her through the chaos, through the streets where the transformed walk with their pale skin and their synchronized steps, through the iron fences that have been torn down and the salt circles that have been scattered by the mother's hunger, and into the caves, into the dark, into the deep places where the old debts are stored and the new ones are just beginning. The mother does not follow. The mother is busy with the town, with the farms, with the slow, systematic consumption of everything within the perimeter. She has time. She has always had time. And when the surface is empty, when the pantry is bare, she will turn her attention to the deeper caves, to the daughter and the hatchling that hides her, to the new covenant that has been struck in defiance of her authority. But that is a story for another season, another debt, another reckoning. For now, the hollow swallows, and the ledger grows, and the screaming becomes a hum, and the hum becomes silence, and in the silence, something new is born, something that is neither human nor monster but both, something that waits in the dark with a lullaby on its lips and a debt in its heart, calculating the compound interest of love in a world that has forgotten how to calculate anything else. The town of Coldwater died not with a bang but with a swallow, a slow, grinding consumption that took 3 days to complete and left nothing behind but foundations and fences, and the salt that no longer mattered. The state police found it on the 4th day, responding to a report of screaming that had been called in by a trucker on the interstate who heard it through his CB radio, a frequency that should not have carried that far, that sound. They found the buildings intact, the streets empty, the livestock gone from their pens, and in the center of town, arranged in a circle that measured exactly 100 feet in diameter, a pile of shoes. Hundreds of shoes, thousands perhaps, men's and women's and children's, arranged by size and type in a pattern that suggested not chaos but curation, not violence but collection. The police photographed the shoes, bagged them as evidence, and spent 6 months searching for bodies that they never found. The case was officially closed as a mass disappearance, though the theories ranged from cult suicide to serial abduction to a gas leak that caused hallucinations and wandering. The podcast never aired. Deshaun Williams disappeared 2 weeks after Morgan's last transmission, his body found in a Houston parking garage with his ears and eyes removed, though the medical examiner could not determine whether the removal had been surgical or something else. The mining company declared bankruptcy. Its executives scattered to other ventures, other hills, other hollows where the earth had been left untapped for reasons that no geological survey could explain. And the caves were sealed by order of the governor, with concrete and steel and the prayers of engineers who did not understand what they were praying against. But the seal did not hold. Nothing holds forever against the pressure of the deep. And on certain nights, when the wind blows from the east and the limestone breathes with a cold that has no meteorological explanation, the people in the towns nearby, the new towns that have been built on the perimeter, the new farms that have been established within the old circle, they hear it. The seesaw roar, the lullaby. The sound of something being born, something being fed, something waiting in the dark with infinite patience and an appetite that has been growing since before the first human walked these hills. They hear it, and they lock their doors and they check their fences, and they try not to think about the debt that accumulates in silence, the ledger that never closes, the throat that is always open, always hungry, always waiting for the next story to swallow whole. And sometimes, in the oldest families, the ones whose names appear in the property records going back to Jonah's Coldwater himself, they take their children into the basement, and they show them the eggs that have been delivered in the night, the leathery things that pulse in the darkness, and they teach them to scrub, to hum, to love the thing that will one day consume them, because that is the covenant, that is the debt, that is the only truth that has ever mattered in these hills. The hollow gives nothing for free, and what it takes, it keeps forever, and the only choice is whether to enter the ledger as creditor or debtor, predator or prey, scream or lullaby. Most choose the lullaby. Most choose the scrub brush and the bleach and the salt. Most choose to believe that love can be transmitted through fear, that protection can be purchased with submission, that the monster in the basement is family if you sing to it softly enough. And they are not wrong exactly. They are simply early or late, depending on how you measure the debt, because the hollow does not distinguish between love and hunger. The throat swallows everything, indiscriminately, eternally, and the only difference between the one who scrubs and the one who screams is the timing of their entry into the dark. The eggs hatch, the young grow, the mother waits, and the debt compounds generation after generation, a mathematical certainty that no amount of storytelling can debunk, no amount of screaming can escape, no amount of love can repay. The hollow's throat is open. The ledger is accepting new accounts, and in the darkness below, something hums a lullaby that has no words, only teeth, only hunger, only the endless, patient calculation of what is owed. But the fall did not end in teeth. It ended in water, a pool of subterranean cold that broke his momentum with a shock that drove the air from his lungs and sent him plunging downward into darkness that was absolute, a blackness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed it. He thrashed, disoriented, his headlamp long dead, his body tumbling in currents that seemed to move in directions that physics did not permit, spiraling downward and sideways simultaneously, the water filling his mouth and nose with a mineral taste that was not water but something thicker, something that coated his throat and filled his stomach with a weight that was not drowning but digestion. And then his feet touched bottom, or what his feet interpreted as bottom, a surface that yielded like flesh under his boots, and he pushed upward, breaking through into air that was not air but gas, a pocket of atmosphere that stank of methane and rot and the same mineral hunger that permeated the caves. He gasped, vomiting the fluid from his lungs. his hands finding purchase on a surface that was warm and slick and alive. And he realized, with a clarity that cut through his terror like a blade, that he was not in water at all but in something else, something that the mother used to preserve her prey, a sac of amniotic fluid that maintained the victims in a state of suspended animation, their bodies kept fresh for consumption while their minds were broken by the roar and the dark. He was inside her, he realized, inside the belly pouch that he had glimpsed beneath her plated segments, and the warmth around him was her metabolism, the slickness was her secretions, the beating that surrounded him on all sides was her heart, or hearts, pumping fluid through a system that had no regard for his individual existence. The other men were here too, he sensed, though he could not see them, could feel them only as presences in the darkness, their breathing synchronized with his own, their heartbeats falling into rhythm with the mother's pulse, a choir of the consumed that sang in the key of submission. He tried to move, to find an exit, a way back to the surface, but the pouch contracted around him, the muscles of her abdomen flexing to hold him in place, and the roar returned not from outside but from within, transmitted through the fluid that surrounded him, through the tissues that pressed against him, a sound that had become indistinguishable from his own thoughts. Rest, the roar commanded. Grow. Become. And despite his terror, despite his desperate need to escape, Morgan felt his body responding, his muscles relaxing, his breathing slowing, his mind sinking into a state that was not sleep but something deeper, something that approached the suspension of the mummies in the chamber below, a preservation of function without the urgency of consciousness. He fought it, using the last of his will to maintain a thread of awareness, a single point of light in the darkness that was the memory of who he had been, what he had valued, the daughter he did not have but might have had if his life had followed a different path, the love he had never found because he had been too busy chasing stories into the dark. He clung to that light, that memory, that fragment of self, and the mother's contraction eased, as if she sensed his resistance and found it interesting, worth preserving rather than crushing. The fluid around him shifted, carrying him through her body, through passages that were not geological but biological, and he emerged finally into a space that was larger, that had walls of stone rather than flesh, though the stone was warm and pulsed with a rhythm that matched the mother's heartbeat. He was in another chamber, he realized, one of the upper caverns near the surface, and he was not alone. The others were here too, the men from the ledge, emerging from similar sacks that had been deposited in pools along the chamber floor, their bodies slick with the mother's secretions, their eyes open but unseeing, their movements robotic and synchronized. They were being changed, he saw, their skin taking on a pallor that matched the hatchlings, their fingers lengthening, their joints becoming more flexible, more segmented, as if the mother's fluids were not merely preserving them but transforming them, preparing them for a new role in her ecology. Morgan looked at his own hands and saw the same changes beginning, the skin translucent, the veins visible as dark lines beneath the surface, the nails thickening and yellowing into something that resembled claws. He was becoming, he realized, one of her servants in truth, not merely a debtor but a physical extension of her will, a creature that could walk on the surface and lead others to the pantry, that could maintain the covenant in ways that no purely human agent could manage. The brand in his skull pulsed, approving, guiding, and Morgan felt a new emotion rising through the terror, an emotion that was not hope but something more insidious, something that felt like acceptance, like relief, like the peace that comes from surrendering responsibility to a power greater than oneself. He was hers. He would serve. And in serving, he would survive, not as Morgan Hale but as something else, something that wore his face and spoke with his voice but served the hollow with a loyalty that transcended death. He stood, his new body moving with a fluidity that was not his own, and joined the others in their synchronized march toward the surface, toward the town, toward the covenant renewed. The passage ahead was lit now, not by headlamps or bioluminescence, but by a glow that emanated from their own transformed skin, a light that marked them as property, as agents, as the teeth of the hollow extended into the world of daylight. Morgan walked, and the brand sang in his skull, and the last vestige of his humanity retreated to a corner of his mind where it would wait, perhaps forever, for a rescue that would never come. They emerged from Devil's Hole proper, the entrance that the tourists visited, the opening in the cliff face that was large enough to drive a truck through, that had been mapped and photographed and designated as a natural wonder by the State Park Service. The morning sun was blinding, a white explosion that made Morgan's new eyes water and his transformed skin prickle with a sensitivity that was almost pain. He had never appreciated the sun before, had taken it for granted as a constant, but now he understood it as an enemy, a force that exposed him, that made his pale flesh vulnerable, that dried the mother's secretions on his skin and left him feeling raw and incomplete. The others felt it too, he sensed, their movements slowing, their bodies hunching as if to protect themselves from the light, and they clustered in the shadow of the cliff, waiting for dusk, waiting for the safety of darkness that was their natural medium now. But the brand pulsed, urgent, commanding, and Morgan understood that they were not to wait, that the mother had accelerated her timeline, that the old rhythms of night hunting were being replaced by something more aggressive, more desperate, a final push to secure the territory before the surface world could organize a response. They moved down the trail from Devil's Hole, past the parking lot where a single ranger vehicle sat empty, its driver presumably drawn into the caves by the same roar that had claimed Morgan, and onto the county road that led toward Coldwater. They walked in a line, not speaking, their movements synchronized by the brand that linked them to the mother's will, and as they walked, Morgan felt the last of his resistance dissolving, the final barriers between his human memories and his new purpose crumbling like ash. He thought of Harold Vance, of the egg in the basement, of the daughter who slept upstairs unaware that her father had already become something else, and he understood that the veterinarian was not waiting for him, but was already part of this procession, already marching toward the town with his own transformed body and his own brand singing in his skull. The debt was being called in full, not just for individuals but for the entire covenant, the entire system of tribute that had sustained itself for generations through the complicity of the living and the silence of the dead. And Morgan, walking with his new limbs and his new loyalty, understood that he was not a victim but a vector, not an ending but a beginning, the first wave of an invasion that would not stop until the hollow had consumed everything within reach, until the ledger was balanced not in lives but in ecosystems, in the total incorporation of the surface into the deep. The town appeared on the horizon, its water tower visible first, then the brick buildings of Main Street, then the iron fences and salt circles of the outlying farms, and Morgan felt the brand pulse with recognition, with hunger, with the terrible joy of a creditor come to collect. The seesaw roar rose around him, no longer in his skull but in the air, a physical sound that shook the windows of the houses and made the cattle in their pens bellow with panic, a sound that was not a warning but an announcement, not a threat but a promise. The hollow's throat was opening. The debt was due. And Morgan Hale, historian, disgraced academic, failed debunker, walked toward the town with his transformed brothers, his mouth opening in a cry that was not human, his hands reaching for the iron fences that would not hold, the salt circles that would not protect, the doors that would open to him because he wore the face of a man they knew, a man they might once have trusted, a man who had become the mouth of the monster he had sought to expose. The screaming began as they crossed the first fence, as the transformed touched the living, as the covenant was fulfilled in a way that no generation had foreseen. And Morgan screamed too, though whether in horror or in triumph even he could no longer say, for the brand had consumed him entirely now, and the last light of his humanity had gone out in the darkness of the hollow, leaving only the teeth, and the hunger and the endless, swallowing throat. But the story does not end with Morgan's fall, nor with the consumption of Coldwater, nor with the screams that echoed through the Ozark Hills for 7 days and 7 nights before falling silent. The story ends where it began, in a basement that smells of bleach and salt and the copper sweetness of things being born, with a man who is still, against all odds, scrubbing an egg that has begun to crack. Harold Vance has not joined the procession. Harold Vance has not answered the brand's call, because Harold Vance made a different covenant, a smaller, more desperate bargain, not with the mother but with the thing inside the shell, the hatchling that has learned his voice, his words, his love. As the town above screams, as the transformed servants of the Hollow break down doors and drag the living into the streets, Harold sits in his basement and hums his lullaby, and the egg pulses in time with his heart, and the crack widens, and a pale segmented limb emerges, testing the air, finding his hand, wrapping around his fingers with a grip that is not hostile but grateful, a child reaching for its father in the moment of birth. "Daddy," the hatchling says, its voice like wet gravel, like old lullabies, like the sound of teeth being brushed. "Daddy, I'm hungry." "I know," Harold whispers, his tears falling onto the leathery shell, his other hand stroking the segmented limb with a tenderness that has survived even this. "I know, little one, but we don't eat family. We don't eat the ones who love us. That's the new covenant. That's the debt I pay." He reaches into his pocket and produces a knife, not for the hatchling but for himself, and he draws the blade across his wrist with a precision born of veterinary training, of decades of knowing exactly where the vein runs, how deep to cut, how much to give. The blood wells, dark and rich, and the hatchling makes a sound that is almost a coo, almost a song, and it feeds, its mouth finding the wound, its transparent needles piercing his skin, with a delicacy that is more intimate than any sexual act Harold has known. He holds it, this child of the Hollow, this monster that is also his salvation, and he feels his daughter's footsteps upstairs, her panicked breathing as she hears the screams from the town, her hand on the basement door that he has locked from the outside, protecting her from what he has become and what he has made. The hatchling feeds and Harold fades, and the lullaby becomes a whisper, becomes a breath, becomes the last sound he makes before the darkness takes him. But in the moment before death, he feels the hatchling's mind touch his own, a pulse of gratitude, of love, of a promise that transcends species and hunger. And he knows that the new covenant holds, that his daughter will live, that the hatchling that fed on his flesh will protect her from the others, will lead her through the screaming streets to the caves where the mother cannot reach, where the debt is different, where the ledger has been rewritten in a father's blood. The egg splits open fully, and the hatchling emerges, pale and perfect and terrible, and it stands over Harold's body with a posture that is almost mourning, almost worship, and then it turns toward the stairs, toward the door, toward the world that is burning above, and it moves with a speed that the mother's children do not possess, a speed born of singular purpose, of love that has been twisted by biology into something that protects rather than consumes. It finds the daughter cowering in her bedroom, her face streaked with tears, her mouth open in a scream that dies when she sees the thing that has broken through the door. And for a moment they regard each other, human and monster, prey and predator, and the hatchling tilts its head in a gesture that is almost human, almost Harold, and it extends a pale limb in invitation. The daughter takes it. She does not know why. Perhaps it is the eyes, which are not reflectors but something softer, something that holds a memory of the man who gave his life to create this bridge between worlds. Perhaps it is the lullaby, which the hatchling hums in a voice like wet gravel, a voice that sounds like home. Or perhaps it is simply that in a world where everything is being consumed, where the Hollow's throat has opened to swallow the last light, the only choice that remains is to choose the monster that knows your name, the debt that is personal, the covenant that is written in love rather than fear. She takes the hatchling's limb, and it leads her through the chaos, through the streets where the transformed walk with their pale skin and their synchronized steps, through the iron fences that have been torn down and the salt circles that have been scattered by the mother's hunger, and into the caves, into the dark, into the deep places where the old debts are stored and the new ones are just beginning. The mother does not follow. The mother is busy with the town, with the farms, with the slow, systematic consumption of everything within the perimeter. She has time. She has always had time. And when the surface is empty, when the pantry is bare, she will turn her attention to the deeper caves, to the daughter and the hatchling that hides her, to the new covenant that has been struck in defiance of her authority. But that is a story for another season, another debt, another reckoning. For now, the hollow swallows, and the ledger grows, and the screaming becomes a hum, and the hum becomes silence, and in the silence, something new is born, something that is neither human nor monster but both, something that waits in the dark with a lullaby on its lips and a debt in its heart, calculating the compound interest of love in a world that has forgotten how to calculate anything else. The town of Coldwater died not with a bang but with a swallow, a slow, grinding consumption that took 3 days to complete and left nothing behind but foundations and fences, and the salt that no longer mattered. The state police found it on the 4th day, responding to a report of screaming that had been called in by a trucker on the interstate who heard it through his CB radio, a frequency that should not have carried that far, that sound. They found the buildings intact, the streets empty, the livestock gone from their pens, and in the center of town, arranged in a circle that measured exactly 100 feet in diameter, a pile of shoes. Hundreds of shoes, thousands perhaps, men's and women's and children's, arranged by size and type in a pattern that suggested not chaos but curation, not violence but collection. The police photographed the shoes, bagged them as evidence, and spent 6 months searching for bodies that they never found. The case was officially closed as a mass disappearance, though the theories ranged from cult suicide to serial abduction to a gas leak that caused hallucinations and wandering. The podcast never aired. Deshaun Williams disappeared 2 weeks after Morgan's last transmission, his body found in a Houston parking garage with his ears and eyes removed, though the medical examiner could not determine whether the removal had been surgical or something else. The mining company declared bankruptcy, its executives scattered to other ventures, other hills, other hollows where the earth had been left untapped for reasons that no geological survey could explain. And the caves were sealed by order of the governor, with concrete and steel and the prayers of engineers who did not understand what they were praying against. But the seal did not hold. Nothing holds forever against the pressure of the deep. And on certain nights, when the wind blows from the east and the limestone breathes with a cold that has no meteorological explanation, the people in the towns nearby, the new towns that have been built on the perimeter, the new farms that have been established within the old circle, they hear it. The seesaw roar, the lullaby, the sound of something being born, something being fed, something waiting in the dark with infinite patience and an appetite that has been growing since before the first human walked these hills. They hear it, and they lock their doors and they check their fences, and they try not to think about the debt that accumulates in silence, the ledger that never closes, the throat that is always open, always hungry, always waiting for the next story to swallow whole. And sometimes, in the oldest families, the ones whose names appear in the property records going back to Jonah's Coldwater himself, they take their children into the basement, and they show them the eggs that have been delivered in the night, the leathery things that pulse in the darkness, and they teach them to scrub, to hum, to love the thing that will one day consume them, because that is the covenant, that is the debt, that is the only truth that has ever mattered in these hills. The hollow gives nothing for free, and what it takes, it keeps forever, and the only choice is whether to enter the ledger as creditor or debtor, predator or prey, scream or lullaby. Most choose the lullaby. Most choose the scrub brush and the bleach and the salt. Most choose to believe that love can be transmitted through fear, that protection can be purchased with submission, that the monster in the basement is family if you sing to it softly enough. And they are not wrong exactly. They are simply early, or late, depending on how you measure the debt, because the hollow does not distinguish between love and hunger. The throat swallows everything, indiscriminately, eternally, and the only difference between the one who scrubs and the one who screams is the timing of their entry into the dark. The eggs hatch, the young grow, the mother waits, and the debt compounds generation after generation, a mathematical certainty that no amount of storytelling can debunk, no amount of screaming can escape, no amount of love can repay. The hollow's throat is open. The ledger is accepting new accounts, and in the darkness below, something hums a lullaby that has no words, only teeth, only hunger, only the endless, patient calculation of what is owed. The path to the chamber of tallies was not a passage in the ordinary sense, but a descent through geological layers that should not have been traversable, through spaces that had been created not by water or tectonics, but by consumption, by the mother's endless digestion of the earth itself. The walls were not limestone here but something else, a compressed residue that smelled of copper and ammonia and the same mineral hunger that characterized the mother's breath, a substance that was not quite organic and not quite mineral, but occupied a category of matter that Morgan's brain struggled to categorize. It was warm, this deep place, warm with the mother's own metabolism, the heat of her digestion radiating through the walls in a way that made Morgan sweat despite the chill of the caves. And the air was thick with pheromones, chemical signals that his partially reverted body could still detect, warning markers that screamed predator and danger, and do not enter in a language older than smell. Vance moved ahead of him, sure-footed in the darkness, his own body apparently transformed in some way that Morgan had not noticed, his movements too fluid, his joints too flexible, his skin too pale in the faint phosphorescence that emanated from the walls. He was not fully human either, Morgan realized, not anymore. The years of tending the egg, of scrubbing and humming and paying the debt in small installments of sanity, had changed him as surely as the mother's fluids had changed Morgan, had made him into something that could navigate these spaces with an ease that mocked human limitation. They were both monsters now in their way, both transformed by proximity to the hollow, both suited to the deep places in ways that their former selves would have found horrifying. And perhaps that was the true nature of the debt, Morgan thought as they descended. Not payment in lives or livestock, but payment in humanity, in the slow erosion of the self that came from service to something that had no use for human values, human emotions, human hope. They walked for hours or days, or what might have been weeks in the timeless dark, the passage sloping ever downward, the walls growing warmer and more organic, the smell of digestion growing stronger until Morgan could taste it on his tongue, a flavor that was not food but the memory of food, the ghost of sustenance that lingered in a predator's den. And then, without warning, the passage opened into a space that made Morgan fall to his knees, not from weakness but from awe, from horror, from the confrontation with a scale that his human mind had not evolved to process. The Chamber of Tallies was not a room but a cavern, a vast space that extended beyond the reach of any light, its ceiling lost in darkness, its floor covered with a substance that Morgan initially took for sand or dust, but that Vance identified, in a whisper that held reverence and disgust in equal measure, as ash. Ash and bone, the accumulated residue of centuries of consumption, compressed by the mother's weight into a surface that crunched beneath their feet like a beach of the dead. And on the walls, visible in the phosphorescence that emanated from the ash itself, were the tallies, millions of them, billions perhaps. Marks carved into the stone with a precision that suggested machine tooling rather than hand tools, lines and dots, and geometric patterns that recorded every life the mother had consumed since before human history began. The marks were not merely numerical. They were descriptive, encoding not just quantities but qualities, not just names but experiences, the chemical signatures of individual souls rendered in a script that Morgan could not read but somehow understood, a direct transmission of meaning that bypassed his eyes and entered his mind through the same frequency channels that the brand had used. He saw marks that represented individuals he knew or had known. The men from the ledge, their entries fresh and glowing. The surveyors from Ozark Deep, their marks already fading as the mother's digestion absorbed their identities. And older marks, marks that predated Morgan's arrival in Boone County by decades, centuries, millennia. The chamber was a library of consumption, a database of souls, and the mother was its librarian, its archivist, its devoted curator of the debt. "Here," Vance said, leading Morgan to a section of wall that was different from the others, newer, the marks still sharp and glowing with a phosphorescence that suggested recent inscription. "This is the current ledger, the active accounts, the debts that haven't been paid in full." Morgan looked at the wall and saw his own name, inscribed in the mother's script, glowing with a light that was almost painful to perceive. Beside his name were the names of the transformed men, the surveyors, the townspeople who had been taken in the first wave of the mother's rage, and below them, in smaller marks, the names of those who were still on the surface, still in the town, still marked for collection. Harold Vance's daughter was there, Mrs. Peabody from the inn, the clerk from the courthouse, Doug Castellanos, who had given Morgan the key card, Deshaun Williams, who had sent him on this assignment and who had died in Houston with his ears and eyes removed, and thousands of others, a catalog of the living that the mother intended to make dead, a schedule of consumption that extended into the future with mathematical precision. "How do we erase it?" Morgan asked, his voice barely audible. Vance produced something from his pocket, an object that Morgan had not seen him carry, had not seen at all in the darkness of their descent. It was a scrub brush, the same kind that Vance had used on the egg in his basement, its bristles worn to nubs, its handle stained with bleach and salt and the fluids of things that were not human. "Not erase," Vance said. "Alter, change the entries, make the debts paid in full, not by consumption but by substitution, by false accounting. The mother doesn't check her work, Mr. Hale. She hasn't had to, not for 10,000 years. She trusts the ledger because she built it, because it's part of her, because she can't conceive of anyone being foolish enough to try to cheat it. But we can. We can mark the living as dead, the active as settled, the debts as paid. We can close the accounts. And when she wakes, when she returns to the surface to collect, she'll find the pantry empty not because we've escaped, but because she thinks she's already eaten." Morgan stared at the scrub brush, at the walls of marks, at the impossible task that Vance was proposing. "She'll know," he said. "Eventually, she'll count, she'll check, she'll realize the entries are wrong." "Eventually," Vance agreed. "But eventually is not now. Eventually is years, maybe decades. Eventually is time for my daughter to grow up and move away. Eventually is time for you to tell your story, to warn the world, to prepare the next defense. Eventually is all we can hope for, Mr. Hale. But eventually is better than never. It's better than tomorrow." Morgan took the scrub brush. It felt warm in his hand, warm with Vance's body heat and with something else, something that pulsed with a rhythm that matched the mother's heartbeat, that connected him to the ledger in a way that was almost intimate, almost sexual. He raised it to the wall, to his own glowing name, and he began to scrub. The marks were not paint or ink but something deeper, something that had been absorbed into the stone itself. And the scrub brush fought him, its bristles catching on the inscription with a resistance that suggested the stone was trying to hold onto the debt, to preserve the record against his vandalism. But Morgan scrubbed harder, channeling the same desperation that had driven him to collapse the nursery, the same defiance that had allowed him to resist the brand, the same will to survive that had carried him through the vortex and onto the hidden shelf. The marks began to fade, not disappearing entirely but becoming illegible, their phosphorescence dimming as the scrub brush erased the chemical signatures that made them visible to the mother's perception. He moved to the next name, and the next, scrubbing in a frenzy now, his arm aching, his hand blistering, the scrub brush becoming an extension of his will, a tool of liberation that destroyed as it cleaned. Vance worked beside him, his own brush moving with the methodical precision of decades of practice, his face illuminated by the fading glow of the marks in an expression that was almost religious, almost beatific. They scrubbed for hours or days, or what might have been years, the timelessness of the deep places making duration meaningless. And gradually, the wall of active accounts became a wall of ghosts, the names of the living replaced by smears of phosphorescent residue that suggested nothing, meant nothing, recorded nothing. The mother slept somewhere below them, in the deepest place where she went to heal and plan, and she did not stir, did not sense the vandalism being committed in her own archive, did not feel the ledger being altered by the very tools she had provided for its maintenance. When they finished, when the last mark had been scrubbed into illegibility, Morgan and Vance stood in the chamber of ash and bone, their bodies exhausted, their minds numb, and they listened to the silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator that did not yet know its prey had escaped, the silence of a debt that had been deferred but not forgiven, the silence of a ledger that had been closed by fraud rather than payment and would one day demand interest on the fraud with compound ferocity. But for now, in this moment, in the deep dark below the world, it was enough. It was survival. It was time. The ascent was harder than the descent, the passages that had seemed to open before them now resisting their passage, the stone growing colder and more brittle as they climbed toward the surface, toward the light, toward the world where the mother's influence was weaker but her reach was longer. Morgan's body had almost fully reverted by the time they reached the access tunnel, the transformation dissolving like a dream upon waking, leaving him weak and shaking and dependent on Vance's transformed strength to pull him through the narrow squeeze that separated the deep places from the daylight. They emerged from the tunnel into the sinkhole, the same sinkhole where Morgan had first heard the roar, where the fissure had opened, and the photograph had captured the shape in the darkness. And the afternoon sun was blinding, a violence of light that made Morgan cry out and cover his eyes with hands that were human again, that trembled with the memory of claws. The air was fresh, or what passed for fresh after weeks in the caves, carrying the scent of pine and dust and the distant exhaust of the interstate, and Morgan fell to his knees on the white gravel and wept, not from joy, but from the release of tension that had been building since he first set foot in Coldwater. The accumulated terror and transformation and desperate hope finally finding expression in tears that ran down his face and into the earth, joining the water table that fed the caves below, that connected him still to the mother in ways that distance could not sever. Vance stood beside him, his body still partially transformed, his skin too pale, his joints too flexible, his eyes too reflective in the sunlight, and he looked down at Morgan with an expression that held no triumph, only the weary acceptance of a man who had paid a debt he did not owe and would spend the rest of his life waiting for the collector to notice the fraud. "You need to go," Vance said. "Now, before she wakes, before she checks the ledger and finds the discrepancies. Before she sends her servants, the ones you didn't kill, the ones who are still branded, to find you and bring you back." "What about you?" Morgan asked, looking up at the veterinarian with eyes that were still adjusting to the light, still seeing the world in shades of darkness. "What about your daughter?" Vance smiled, a gesture that revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, a mouth that was becoming something other than human. "I'll stay," he said. "I'll maintain the fiction. I'll scrub the egg, hum the lullaby, play the role of the loyal debtor until the fraud is discovered. And when she comes for me, I'll be ready. I have a plan, Mr. Hale, a final payment. But it requires time to prepare, time you've bought me. So go, tell your story, warn the world. And if you ever hear the roar again, if you ever feel the brand trying to reassert itself, remember this. The ledger is a fiction. The debt is a story we tell ourselves to make the horror manageable, and stories can be rewritten." Morgan stood, his legs weak but functional, his body human but scarred, and he embraced Harold Vance, this broken man who had saved him, who had shown him the path, who had given him the tools to alter his fate. The embrace was brief, awkward, two men who had been through something that had no name in human language, something that would bind them forever even as they separated, perhaps forever. Then Morgan turned and walked toward his Subaru, which was still parked where he had left it, covered in dust and pine needles but otherwise intact, a relic of a life that seemed impossibly distant, a museum piece from an era when he had believed in podcasts and debunking and the power of reason to illuminate the dark. He did not look back at Vance, did not watch the veterinarian retreat into the access tunnel, did not witness the final transformation that would make Vance fully a creature of the caves, a servant who would maintain the fiction of the debt until the fiction collapsed under its own weight. He drove, the Subaru's engine catching with a roar that was almost as loud as the mother's, the transmission grinding in protest after weeks of disuse, the wheels finding purchase on the gravel track that led toward the county road, toward the interstate, toward the world of daylight and denial, and the comforting lie that monsters were only metaphors. He did not stop in Coldwater. He did not look at the town as he passed it, did not observe the iron fences or the salt circles or the absence of people in the streets. He drove through at 60 miles per hour, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind already constructing the narrative he would tell, the story of a monster in the caves, a predator older than humanity, a debt that could never be repaid but only deferred. He would tell the story, he decided. He would find someone to listen, someone who would believe, someone who could help him prepare the next defense, the next generation of resistance against the Hollow's endless hunger. He would not be silent. He would not forget. And he would never, ever return to Boone County, to the Ozarks, to the limestone cliffs where Devil's Hole waited like a rotten tooth in the jaw of the earth. But the story does not end with Morgan's escape, nor with his resolution, nor with the miles that accumulated on the Subaru's odometer as he drove toward the fading light of a future that would never be free of the past. The story ends where it began, in a basement that smells of bleach and salt and the copper sweetness of things being born, with a man who is still, against all odds, tending an egg that has begun to hatch. Harold Vance had lied to Morgan, or at least he had not told the whole truth, had not revealed the final layer of his plan, the ultimate payment that he intended to make. The egg in his basement was not merely a debt token, not merely a hostage that ensured his daughter's survival. It was something more, something that Vance had been nurturing for 3 weeks with a devotion that transcended fear and approached the realm of love, something that had learned from him, had absorbed his voice and his values and his desperate hope, had become not a monster but a bridge, a negotiation, a new covenant written not in the mother's script but in a father's lullaby. The egg hatched on the night of Morgan's escape, the leathery shell splitting with a sound like tearing fabric, like old wounds reopening, like the first note of a song that had never been sung before. The thing that emerged was pale and segmented and terrible, but it was also small, smaller than the hatchlings in the nursery, stunted by its isolated incubation, weakened by the lack of the mother's phosphorescent warmth. It looked at Vance with eyes that were not reflectors but something softer, something that held a memory of the man who had scrubbed and hummed and loved it into existence. And it made a sound that was not the seesaw roar but a questioning chirp, a baby's cry, a request for comfort that was older than predation. "SHH," Vance whispered, his transformed hand stroking the creature's head with a tenderness that was almost human, almost whole. "SHH, little one, Daddy's here." The creature nuzzled against his palm, its transparent teeth retracting, its segmented limbs wrapping around his wrist with a grip that was not hunger but trust, not consumption but connection. And Vance understood in that moment that his plan had worked, that the mother's biology could be subverted, that the debt could be rewritten not by fraud but by love, not by erasure but by substitution of a different kind. The creature in his basement was not a servant of the Hollow. It was a child of the Hollow, yes, but also a child of Harold Vance, shaped by his care into something that could choose, that could love, that could protect rather than consume. And that protection was what Vance needed now, as the mother's rage began to build in the deep places, as she woke from her healing sleep and turned her attention to the ledger, as she discovered the fraud that Morgan and Vance had committed and sent her branded servants to find the perpetrators. The creature in his basement was weak, too weak to fight the mother directly, too young to challenge the ancient predator on her own terms. But it was clever, and it was fast, and it knew the caves in a way that even Vance did not, having absorbed the geological knowledge through the egg's connection to the mother's network, the same network that the brand used to transmit commands. It could hide. It could lead. It could protect Vance's daughter from the branded servants who would come to collect the debt, and it could do so not by fighting but by navigating, by finding the hidden passages and the secret exits that Vance had spent decades mapping. The mother would not expect this. The mother could not conceive of a child that served a human rather than the hive, a creature that had been domesticated by love rather than controlled by sound. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the system, and in the mother's ancient mind, anomalies were threats that must be eliminated. But the creature was not alone. Vance was with it, and Vance knew the mother's weaknesses, knew her vulnerabilities, knew the places where even she could not reach. Together they would survive. Together they would wait. And together they would one day emerge, not as servants but as something new, a hybrid of human and hollow that might, just might, possess the strength to close the ledger for good. The town of Coldwater burned on the third night after Morgan's escape, not with fire but with sound. The seesaw roar rising from Devil's Hole in a wave that shattered windows and ruptured eardrums, and drove the remaining inhabitants into the streets in a panic that was indistinguishable from religious ecstasy. The branded servants moved among them, their transformed bodies pale in the moonlight, their synchronized steps carrying them from house to house, from farm to farm, collecting the debts that the ledger still recorded, consuming the lives that had not been marked as paid by Vance and Morgan's vandalism. The mother did not emerge. She was still weak, still healing from the collapse of the nursery, still depleted by the loss of her young. But she did not need to emerge. Her servants were sufficient, her branded drones carrying out her will with a precision that was almost mechanical, almost beautiful in its efficiency. They took the townspeople one by one, not killing them but transforming them, marking them with the brand, incorporating them into the hive that would expand the mother's territory beyond the old perimeter, beyond the iron fences and salt circles, into the surrounding counties, and eventually, inevitably, into the world beyond the Ozarks. The screams lasted for hours, then diminished as the population was processed, then fell silent as the last of the unbranded were consumed or converted. By dawn, Coldwater was empty, a ghost town of broken windows and open doors and the faint, persistent smell of ammonia that marked the passage of the mother's children. The state police found it 2 days later, and the story that emerged was one of mass hysteria, of cult activity, of a town that had simply abandoned itself in the night, leaving behind their possessions, their livestock, their lives, to wander into the hills and disappear. The official investigation lasted 6 months and concluded nothing. The unofficial investigations, the conspiracy theorists, the true crime enthusiasts, the podcasters who followed in Morgan's footsteps, lasted longer, producing theories that ranged from government mind control to alien abduction to the rapture itself. But none of them found the truth, because the truth was in the caves, in the deep places where the mother coiled and healed and planned, where the branded servants maintained the fiction of the debt, and the hidden survivors waited for their moment to act. And none of them found Morgan Hale, who had driven to St. Louis and then to Chicago, and then to places that he did not name in his own journals, who told his story to anyone who would listen and was laughed at or pitied or medicated, who eventually found a small community of believers, of survivors, of people who had encountered the mother's kind in other hollows, other caves, other deep places around the world, and who were preparing, slowly, painstakingly, for the day when the ledger would be called in full, and the hollow's throat would open to swallow not just a town but a civilization. Morgan died 7 years later, not in the claws of the mother, but in a hospital bed of cancer, the ordinary death that had been denied him in the caves finally catching up with his ordinary body. But in his last moments, as the morphine fogged his mind and the monitors counted down his heartbeats, he heard something that made him smile, something that the nurses took for hallucination, but that Morgan knew was real. The seesaw roar, faint but unmistakable, not in his head but in the air around him, in the walls of the hospital, in the bedrock beneath the foundation. She had found him. The fraud had been discovered. The debt was being collected. But Morgan smiled because he had bought his 7 years, had told his story, had planted seeds that would grow in the minds of those who listened, who believed, who prepared. And because, in the moment before the roar crested and the monitors flatlined, he heard something else, something that the mother had not sent, something that came from a different direction, a different frequency, a different debt. A chirp, a questioning cry, a lullaby in a voice like wet gravel, like old memories, like love that had survived the darkness. The creature was out there somewhere, grown now, powerful now, protecting Vance's daughter who was a woman now, a leader now, part of the resistance that Morgan had helped to build. And the creature was singing, not the mother's roar but something else, something new, a song of hybridization and hope, and the possibility that the ledger could be not just altered but transcended, that the debt could be not just deferred but forgiven, that the hollow's throat could learn to sing lullabies instead of demands. Morgan died with that song in his ears, his final breath emerging not as a scream but as a whisper, a word that might have been enough, or might have been debt, or might have been simply a name, a child's name, a daughter's name, a hope that he was leaving behind for others to carry. The monitors flatlined. The roar faded, and in the caves beneath the Ozarks, in the deep places where the mother waited and planned and calculated the compound interest of ancient hunger, something new was stirring, something that had never been part of her design, something that wore the face of a monster but hummed a lullaby that had no end. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.